Beaner Gringo, From Mexican Kid to American JD, by Ivan Higuera. Narrated by Ivan Higuera. Chapter 1. Mexico. I have found that the short period between my birth in Mexico to my immigration to the U.S. left me with at least 3 lasting impressions about Spanish as my mother tongue and protection. After all, few parents would find odd the idea that young children are impressionable. This lesson from common experience has not evaded the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court in significant cases, including Lemon v. Kurtzman, in which the court declared unconstitutional state statutes that gave state financial assistance to non-public religious schools as violative of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and in which it considered the impressionable character of children in those schools, as in the following. This process of inculcating religious doctrine is, of course, enhanced by the impressionable age of the pupils in primary schools particularly. Citation: Lemon v. Kurtzman, 403 U.S. 602, 616, 1971. That is, early childhood can be a period in which ideas, feelings, or opinions about people, things, and the world can form without conscious thought or on the basis of little evidence. Similarly, the importance to a child of his or her mother tongue has not entirely escaped consideration in significant cases that make up the landscape of American jurisprudence, such as Meyer v. Nebraska, in which the U.S. Supreme Court held unconstitutional the application of a state statute that attempted to forbid teaching a non-English language, including German, to children before the 8th grade, under the liberty prong of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. However, while the court found the means the statute constituted in relationship to the goals unreasonable, it did not oppose the goals themselves. These goals of the state legislature to promote English as the mother tongue of all children reared in that state rested upon reasons including that it is a well-known fact that the language first learned by a child remains his mother tongue and the language of his heart. The purpose of the statute is to ensure that the English language shall be the mother tongue and the language of the heart of the children reared in this country, who will eventually become the citizens of this country. Citation: Meyer v. Nebraska, 262 U.S. 390, 396, 1923. Thus, the importance of a child's mother tongue was not itself denied by Meyer. It was not denied that a child's mother tongue is susceptible to the formation of deeply held feelings. Deeply held feelings, as in my case, are also capable of arising from a child's experiences with the employment of serious and excessive physical maltreatment by his father. This common sense notion has been indicated as well by the vulnerability of child abuse victims that landmark cases in American jurisprudence have implicitly recognized, such as in Maryland v. Craig, in which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld against a challenge brought under the Confrontation Clause of the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a state statute that sought to prevent emotional distress to testifying children who had suffered child abuse, i.e., we likewise conclude today that a state's interest in the physical and psychological well-being of a child abuse victim may be sufficiently important to outweigh, at least in some cases, a defendant's right to face his or her accusers in court. Citation: Maryland v. Craig, 497 U.S. 836, 853, 1990. That is, acts of child abuse can leave the victim emotionally and psychologically vulnerable so as to justify the adoption of measures as significant as limiting constitutionally protected rights. Why then should it appear so very odd that a child who experiences acts of serious and excessive physical maltreatment by his father from a very young age should develop a sense of connection to the weak and vulnerable, as I have found to have happened in my case? I fail to find it so odd. Why should it be so very odd? In those circumstances, feelings and opinions in that child should tend towards a deep-seated drive to embody an autonomous source of protection against threats, as I have found to have happened in my case. I fail to find that it is so odd. Birth, parents, sisters. My origins are Spanish-speaking and not English-speaking because I was born in Mexico, specifically Ciudad Victoria, capital of the northern state of Tamaulipas, and grew up there. 2 years in Ciudad Victoria, 3 in Mexico City, until the age of 5. My parents were also born and raised in Mexico, my mother in Mexico City, my father in the northern state of Tamaulipas. They have always been primarily Spanish-speaking. See if you can imagine yourself in your first moment of memory. When I do so, I find that in that instant, I am in my family's home in Mexico City and in my white crib, which has been placed on my mom's side of the bed with my pudgy pink hand in my mom's hand, made available to me with a sense of traditional duty, reminiscent of the manner with which she set the table every day, 3 times a day, and busied herself serving the food or finishing up another chore or tending to my sister or me, so that I only saw her peck at a rolled up tortilla and some beans during meal times, until she picked up the plates when everyone else was finished with his or her meal. As my mom has since confirmed, for several years after my birth in 1983 in Ciudad Victoria, Tamaulipas, near my father's birthplace in the north of Mexico, it was impossible to get me to fall asleep unless my mom let me feel her small, soft, warm hand, sometimes for a half hour, sometimes less, sometimes more. But there's a darker side to my early memories in Mexico, like a stormy skies coming together with an earthquake and the feeling of stern shadows. My father. The only memory I have of that time with my father comes from the time in which I was already in preschool, because I was ultimately dressed up in a sailor's costume to participate in a parade at preschool. At that time, I was seriously hit by my father at around 10 a.m. in the morning on the bed of my parents' bedroom. There was a bed in the center of the room. I was on it, a pudgy wore mass of sniffles with rosy cheeks due to a cold. There was my blue and white sailor's outfit laid out on the bed next to me for me to wear in the school parade that day at noon. There was my mom over by the bedroom door, her gaze apprehensively trained on the micro movements of my dad's facial features as she tried to convince him in her plaintive voice that I should not be made to participate in the parade. When my father snapped, I was hunched over. Suddenly I could feel it begin to hail blows, as if for an hour. I feel his heavy hands, the jarring of my bones, the short-circuiting of my sensory system, as I found myself sent out and repeatedly returned to the feeling of being in the world. Then the delay between one blow and the next, then the instability of my body, and then a sense of suspension, and then the hard slap of the cold tiles of the floor against my palms as I landed, and then felt a shove of a shoe, until my mother finished saying for the last time, "Leave him alone already. Déjalo ya. You're going to hurt him. Lo vas a lastimar," and began to carry me back onto the bed. My father stormed off. A few hours later, my father took photographs of the school parade. There is one in which I appear alone with my sailor suit, rosy cheeks, and sad face. In contrast, my first sister in time, Dolores, often called Lolis in her native Mexico, and 1 year older than me, did not hold my mom's hand to fall asleep. Neither did my second sister, US born and 7 years younger than me, hold my mom's hand to fall asleep. Chapter 2. Early Days in the USA. I have found that the initial period of my life in the US was arguably like a blueprint written in invisible ink. After all, in light of the previous chapter, why should it be surprising that a 5-year-old child could develop, as I find myself having been capable of doing, a sense of loss regarding his mother tongue upon finding himself uprooted from one day to the next from the pervasive sounds of his Latin mother tongue and transplanted for the indefinite future into the pervasive Germanic sounds of English? I fail to find it is so very surprising. Furthermore, it is not unknown that in some people amongst whom I find that I could be included, hope springs eternal. It is not unknown and has even given occasion for humor on part of some California appellate courts. Thus, in County of San Luis Obispo v. Superior Court, a California appellate court determined that a party seeking relief under a mechanism known as a writ could not obtain it because he no longer had the required interest in the land at issue for relief to be available to him, to which the party had argued that he could require that interest one day, eliciting the observation by the Court of Appeal of California, "Hope springs eternal, but writ relief is temporal and requires firmer substance." Citation: County of San Luis Obispo v. Superior Court, 90 Calap 4th 288, 293, Calap 2001. Moreover, why should it be so very odd that a young boy who finds himself, as I find myself having been, subject to extra privations, including in his early years, compared with those borne by his sister, when that differential treatment is not substantially called for by reference to his sister's sex, could go on to form feelings of intense dislike towards unjustified inequality of treatment in the future? I fail to find it so very odd. And in fact, this interest that even a boy could have in not being told reflexively that he is to carry greater burdens because of his status as a boy can even be found reflected in notable cases in the rich landscape of American jurisprudence, that often invisible source of why we are forced to not do this but to do that in matters ranging from buying groceries to buying homes. Thus, in Mississippi University for Women v. Hogan, in which the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated a state university's refusal to allow males to enroll in its school of nursing because the distinction made as to the applicant's sex lacked a sufficient relationship to the alleged reason of compensated for limited opportunities for women in nursing. Most nurses were women then. The court noted that this statutory policy discriminates against males rather than against females, does not exempt it from scrutiny or reduce the standard of review. The party seeking to uphold a statute that classifies individuals on the basis of their gender must carry the burden of showing an exceedingly persuasive justification for the classification. Mississippi University for Women v. Hogan, 458 U.S. 718, 723, 1982. That is, common experience and American jurisprudence are in sync with the idea that a boy does not necessarily have a lower interest than his sister in avoiding knee-jerk, sex-based reasoning for the imposition upon him of a greater burden than his sister. Furthermore, as I find to have happened in my case, why should it be so very odd that physical threat realized by a young boy's father upon the other women in that boy's immediate family could either lead those women to treat that boy too as a similar threat, even in the absence of any history of assaultive conduct by that boy, or lead these women to more than legitimately impose demands on that boy for conformity with with a standard of behavior governed by the resulting subjective preferences. I find that this happened in my case, but I fail to find it so odd. In fact, it is not odd either, in the light of the interest people are recognized to have in the vast landscape of American jurisprudence by sources that are widely cited in American jurisprudence as persuasive authority, including the Restatement Second of Torts. This source reflects the widespread recognition of an interest in preserving the inviolability of one's person, qualifying, however, that in cases in which no substantial or tangible bodily harm results, that interest is subject to a requirement of reasonableness and intentional conduct, as opposed to merely negligent conduct, i.e., the interest which one has in the inviolability of his person, and therefore in freedom from unpermitted contacts, which, while offensive to a reasonable sense of personal dignity, cause no substantial or tangible bodily harm, is an interest of dignitary rather than of material value. As such, it is protected only against intentional invasion. Citation: Restatement Second of Torts, Section 18. That is, it is not so very odd that the law should recognize and seek to protect people's interests, and thus it is not odd that those women should have an interest they could seek to protect in avoiding threats to the inviolability of their person. However, in terms of legitimate demands, they erred to the extent that they set the bar for that interest to be met as their subjective preference, irrespective of evidence of intentionality, instead of a standard based on reasonableness and intentionality in the absence of substantial or tangible bodily harm. Also, why should it be so very odd that in the face of those higher than legitimate exactions, as I find to have occurred in my case, that boy could develop the consciousness that his freedom could be subject out in the world beyond to higher than legitimate exactions reference to subjective preference? Also, why should it sound so very odd that such a boy could develop a corresponding consciousness that his rightful exercise of freedom might require the ability to articulate a defense of his rightful presence, as I find having happened in my case? I fail to find it so odd, not least because identifying the centrality that the home and the occupants of the home could have in connection to each other presents no earth-shattering act, where that centrality has been reflected since time out of mind in sayings such as home is where the heart is. Further, the idea that the exercise of one's liberty need not be like a vane's turning on the direction in which the winds of others' subjective preferences happen to blow is not merely a common experience, but also one that is not foreign to American jurisprudence. Thus, in Wisconsin v. Yoder, in which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld an exemption of the Amish from certain compulsory education requirements under the pre-exercise clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the court qualified that as a general matter, the very concept of ordered liberty precludes allowing every person to make his own standards on matters of conduct in which society as a whole has important interests. Citation: Wisconsin v. Yoder, 406 U.S. 205, 215-16, 1972. That is, it is not so very odd that a person could find himself subject to greater than legitimate exactions like those described above, and in turn find himself developing the consciousness that his freedom could be subject out in the world beyond to higher than legitimate exactions reference to subjective preference. Because what is odd is to find oneself in the U.S. with his or her rightful exercise of freedom not subjected to the impersonal rules of ordered society, but instead to subjective preferences. That person could understandably develop a corresponding consciousness that the exercise of his rightful liberty might require of him the ability to articulate a defense of it. Lastly, it is hardly a well-kept secret, to which I have found myself privy regardless, that the inability to speak English fluently can reduce the field of available employment to low-paying jobs, which in turn can result in a weak socioeconomic status, where a weak socioeconomic status can in turn limit access to educational and other resources. From church floors to kindergarten. See if you can imagine the following in light of your knowledge of the story so far. It feels as though only 2 days ago your 5-year-old Max was wandering about, as I was, at a sort of farmer's market. Your mom had referred to it as a tianguis. Vente van, vamos al tianguis. They're like a Mexican version of one of Shakespeare's weird sisters. An old woman with a shawl and wrinkled, leathery brown skin had been sitting roasting peanuts with her eyes on you, smiling her partly toothless gums at you. Placing some peanuts in your hand, she cooed at you in Mexican Spanish, inquiring into your mom's whereabouts. ¿Y tu mami, güerito? ¿Quieres venirte a casa conmigo, güerito? Then you had felt your mom's small feet and voice behind you, as she diplomatically got the woman to leave you alone in Mexican Spanish with the white lie. No se moleste, señora. Al niño no le sientan bien los cacahuates. Vente, Iván, que tenemos a tu abuelita esperándonos. Your mom then warned you in Mexican Spanish that you could be kidnapped if you talked to strangers. And notwithstanding the threat she spoke of, you felt reassured by knowing that your mom knew about it and that your mom had made you know about it in Mexican Spanish. Iván, no hables con gente desconocida. No te das cuenta que secuestran a los niños para luego exigir un rescate? But today it feels like 2 days have passed since then, and American English and its concomitants displays familiar airs and walls of Mexican Spanish in a Greyhound bus station in Riverside, California, loudly, roughly, grotesquely upon the ears, the way gargoyles would probably sound if they could speak. Excuse me, what'd you say? Oh, food? Well, there's a hot dog vendor over there, so you can go there to get some food if you're hungry. Phone? Oh yeah, there's a payphone just over there, ma'am. feeling butterflies in my belly. I had never seen my parents' dignified heads bow and their faces smile subserviently as often as they did now, after repeating, "Yes, thank you," as if before royalty. Fast forwarding a bit, however, it felt like those familiar walls where the air were restored when I met my kindergarten teacher, Miss Hernandez, on my first day of school. On the first day of class, I silently watched from the safety of a bench at the school entrance, the bulky forms of students streaming past me with big backpacks, when Miss Hernandez's young, shiny, black-haired form appeared, clothed in a white blouse with a gray vest over it, a long gray skirt, and black dress shoes with a silver clasp on the side. In contrast to her brown skin, she inspired the feeling in me that I recognized her, and that she recognized me when the sounds of her Mexican Spanish struck my ears. "Tú has de ser Iván, pequeño. Buenos días. Soy la señorita Hernández y voy a ser tu profesora de kinder." I told her I was hungry. "Buenos días. Tengo hambre." Startled a bit, she quickly recovered. "¿No desayunaste? Pobre criatura. Ven conmigo y te llevo a la cafetería." Back at the Greyhound bus station, I was not told that my parents would be staying on their visitor's visas in the U.S. for good. My dad ordered hot dogs from a hot dog vendor, and I thought they were delicious, with their warm, soft, semi-damp bun and their sweet relish, mayo, and ketchup, and a line of tangy mustard. My dad had begun wolfing down his hot dog some time ago, and he was stuffing the last quarter of it into his mouth when my mom returned from using the payphone. The two evoked a pale Chihuahua, Mom, and an American Bulldog, Dad. My mom said in the plaintive tone she adopted whenever she was about to confront my dad on some matter, as she would be doing now over his buying my sister and I junk food, instead of waiting to arrive at our destination, where she could whip something up for us. Víctor Manuel, no sé por qué tienes siempre que comprarles porquerías a los niños. Acabo de hablar con la hermana Anita y dice que podemos alojarnos en la iglesia como teníamos acordado. Se pueden esperar a comer hasta que lleguemos a la iglesia y ahí les preparo algo. Like an American Bulldog might habitually paw away a feisty Chihuahua, my dad, as usual, pawed away my mom's complaints, reframing them disparagingly as just another one of her attempts to find a reason to argue about something. Bueno, los niños tenían hambre. Deja de buscar motivos para alegar. No iba a dejar que anduvieran con el estómago vacío hasta que se arreglara lo del alojamiento. My earliest experiences in the U.S. saw me greeting uncertainty with curiosity as to whether an opportunity to find reward existed beyond the uncertainty. Thus, that night, I felt nervous expectation in my belly, because a sense of adventure filled me as I realized I was to sleep on the floor of an assembly hall of the church on a single sleeping bag that had been unzipped and spread out, so that my mom, dad, sister, and I could barely fit within its four corners. My mother had already stopped giving me hugs and kisses at that age, i.e. not more than 5 years of age, and I ended up on the end of the sleeping bag furthest to my left as I lay face up, with my dad on the opposite end next to my mom, who was in turn next to my sister, who had left her little leg angled outward to detect if I got too close. The floor was made of fake ceramic tiles, polished and hard, but from my sleeping bag, I surveyed the glow of the sodium streetlights, filtering through green, blue, and yellow colors of the stained glass windows that I had gotten to see before the sunset were ornamented with images of saints or of Jesus Christ. I could not wait until morning because I had decided to explore the surroundings the following day. Likewise, on my first day of kindergarten, the river of foreigners, bulkier to me than the average Mexican, had streamed past my uncertain gaze, unable to defeat the twinkling hope inside that I could find food beyond. As I had accompanied Miss Hernandez, the smell of French toast sticks had fueled that hope, and as I dipped them in maple syrup and munched contentedly on them, any uncertainty became secondary. Indeed, over the next few weeks of exploring my surroundings, I got my first bike in the US when I found a yellow Schwinn bike with big curving handlebars and a banana seat just lying there close to the sidewalk. I rode it constantly throughout the day, with the warm air of Riverside parting against my face as the rubber tread of the tires rolled softly along the asphalt of a basketball court behind the church's assembly hall. However, I got reprimanded by my mother for taking it. "Iván, esa bicicleta no es tuya. ¿De dónde la conseguiste? Espero que no hayas hecho una travesura. Ay, qué niño." My dad said that he did not want to have anything to do with the matter because he had a new job at Motel 6 and did not have time for foolishness. Ay, no tengo tiempo para tonterías. My mom dressed me up with a khaki and white colored Christmas sweater, brown corduroy pants, and brown dress shoes. She herself put on a white blouse with a flowery pink suit coat, brown polyester flared dress pants, and way too much perfume. She was touching up her curly brown hair that made her head look like a microphone on a skinny, white-skinned, 4'9" mass of untoned flesh when she told me what I was going to do. "Ahorita me vas a llevar al lugar en el que hallaste esa bicicleta. Iván, no puedes tomar lo que no es tuyo. Ay, qué niño, nos vas a meter en problemas. Espero que no nos hayas metido en un problema." Saddened by the loss I expected would result on my bike, I complied nonetheless. As we approached the place near the sidewalk on which I had found the bike, my mother angled her head as if the size of the woman who was working obliviously under frown lines set by effort and experience on setting up a garage sale in her lawnless yard. My mother, unnoticed, looked intensely at her, like a lioness watches its prey before pouncing. She pressed her lips and then transformed herself into a series of bashful clasping of her hands and smiling as she asked the 40-something heavy-set Anglo-American woman with sunburned cheeks and shoulders, donning a white beater, "Excuse me, señora, ¿sabe español? No?
Sorry, señora, my son take the bike. He no, but now learn. I say to him, no take thing, if the thing's no yours. The woman paused and remained standing as if trying to track an approaching projectile throughout. At the end of my mom's spiel, her frown lines melted as she returned a grandmotherly smile in a smoker's voice. Oh, that little rascal. He took it because scatterbrain that I am. I left it right up by the sidewalk as I'm getting my things ready for a garage sale. Look, the garbage man would have probably taken it, thinking it was trash. Go ahead and tell your little boy he can keep it. What's his name? Ivan? Like Ivan the Terrible. It's just been sitting in the garage, and if my son were here, he's the type that would tell me to give it to him. My earliest experiences showed me I was prone to elicit disapproval in contrast to my sister, however. The nuns, being the ones who had alerted my mom about the bike, followed up their pretense of leaving the affair to my parents to sort out with an oblique approach, throughout which they intimated approval of my sister and disapproval towards me.
Among other things, because I had taken extra cereal. Bueno, señora, esperamos que se haya aclarado todo con respecto a la bicicleta. Fíjese, todas nosotras, la hermana Susana, la hermana Anita y las demás nos preguntábamos, pero bueno, ¿de dónde ha sacado el niño esa bicicleta? Supongo que el asunto ya ha quedado resuelto. Es que el niño y su hermana son como el día y la noche. La Lolis, es un amor, tan tranquila y tan bien portada. Pero al niño hay que vigilarlo bien, que es muy travieso. Fíjese, ya lo hemos agarrado con las manos en la masa en la despensa, hurtando una caja de cereal. It was true. I had taken cereal, Honey O's to be exact, and milk from the pantry of the church. But my mom had begun work at McDonald's, and then left my breakfast in the hands of the nuns, and the nuns were leaving out in their veiled complaint to my mom the fact that they served me minuscule portions of milk and cereal, and that I had complained that my stomach grumbled. Oh, hermana Anita, todavía tengo hambre. Luego me gruñe el estómago. Meanwhile, my sister had cried because she saw that I had gotten a bike. She said that my mother always got me what I wanted in her little Spanish-speaking person Spanish, which when I've heard children speaking Spanish has always struck me as more elaborate in terms of syntactical complexity compared to their English-speaking counterparts. Siempre se le consigue a Iván lo que él pide, pero cuando yo pido algo siempre se me niega. No está bien. Ahora tiene él una bici mientras que yo ni siquiera tengo una muñeca. The cereal episode ended with my mom's donation of 2 cereal boxes of Honey O's. Hermana Anita, solo quería comunicarle que con respecto a lo del cereal sentimos mucho la molestia que el niño haya ocasionado. Ya se le ha inscrito en el kinder y así se le mantendrá ocupado durante el día. Si está bien, quisiera dejar con usted estas 2 cajas de cereal para reponer lo que el niño tomó. The nun took the boxes of cereal and thanked my mom for the donation. Soon after, the nuns presented my mom with offer upon offer for a place to live in the locality until my parents accepted the cheapest option, one for a 1-bedroom studio with a separate kitchen, the Anglo-American landlord of which lived in a house on the same parcel of land with his Anglo-American girlfriend and had a severe drinking problem, as I saw a manifestation of when I walked out to the kitchen on day 2 of our tenancy and found his bald, white, obese form face down on the floor, surrounded by blood and blood clots, still spasming as he retched from over-ingestion of tequila, his girlfriend screaming at him in English. My first day of kindergarten came soon thereafter. My dad made me ride on the handlebars of a second-hand sky blue road bike he had gotten for $10, the hand grips of which had white wrapping that was becoming unraveled as we rode across the train tracks under a morose and overcast gray sky on the way to Home Gardens Elementary School in Corona, California. My tailbone was struck by the hard edge of the handlebar structure as we went over the railroad tracks at a brisk pace, and my lower back had suddenly begun to ache resentfully until I had met Ms. Hernandez and had gotten a full meal in my belly. He was dropping me off on the way to work at Motel 6, after 8 hours of which he would trek to the local hospital to finish the night off as a janitor, on one of which he was bitten by a psychiatric patient on the hand within 2 weeks of starting, and the moment my feet hit the pavement, he was already pedaling away off into the distance. My sister would arrive to school by car with a recent friend she had made in the neighborhood. My mother had said that anyway, because I was a boy, I had to become strong, and that she simply could not have my sister walking her to school. De todos modos, el niño tiene que hacerse fuerte. La niña es más delicada, como es de esperar. No se le puede permitir que vaya a pie a la escuela, pobrecita, ni pensarlo. Por fortuna, la mamá de su amiguita ya se ha ofrecido para acercarla a la escuela con su hija. Aunque claro está, se le tendrá que dar alguna remuneración a la señora. Dad hits mom and the fallout. Imagine you are a kindergartner, sleeping in the only room of your house apart from a kitchen. You know your sister's in the bedroom with you, and you know your dad and your mom must be in the kitchen. It was 12:30 a.m. or so when a sudden scraping of chairs in the other room startled me from sleep. My sister was sleeping in the same bed at the opposite end and shot up like a spring, her bewildered eyes glowing in the rectangle of yellowish light that crept in through the partially open bedroom door. I heard my dad's booming voice become mangled with effort, heard a crack of a leather belt on my mom's flesh, heard my mother's delicate whimpering, and finally heard her pleading for him to stop. When the incident with the landlord happened, I had not felt as weak and despondent as I did now, thinking about my mom's soft hands, her tremulous voice. This was not the last time my dad hit or threatened to hit my mother. The last time occurred when I was already in 7th grade and attending Kennedy Middle School in Road City, and she finally called the police after he had raised the fist in front of her face. They had arrived in 5 minutes of the call, lighting up the curtains of our one-bedroom apartment that faced the street from the second story, with blue and red lights, and my dad had walked out, showing his hands above his head and a pleading look on his face, whilst proceeding to stammer in his heavily Spanish-accented English, a desperate, unpersuasive, and lying explanation that he had tried to clarify some matter to her, and that her having too much work lately had made her misinterpret his words, after first doing so in Spanish. Ella tiene mucho trabajo últimamente, señores oficiales, y se ha tomado mal una aclaración que le hice, as they say in Spanish, with pleading eyes of a butchered lamb, cara de cordero degollado. He was not arrested, however. My older sister had arched her eyebrows afterwards and cautioned, "You better be careful too, because next time you talk back, Mom's going to call the cops on you too." But my mother did not call the cops on me on the basis of any physical threat. I never displayed aggressiveness towards my mom, probably not because strictly speaking I was incapable of it, but for reasons including that my mother never hit me, that she had always delegated the task of disciplining me to my dad, that my friends' mothers had given me food, that they spoke of my mom in terms of, "Heed your mother's advice. No one loves you more than she does, and she knows what's best for you. Ay, hazle caso a tu mamá, que nadie te quiere más que ella. Ella sabe lo que te conviene más." It was also striking to me that my mother needed to use oven mitts and hold the food-filled pan with both hands, but neither my dad nor I did so, and thus there was a category of people represented by my mother who figured in my mind as an improper object of violence. Yet my sister's prediction materialized because my mother did call the police when I was 13 years old, after I had raised my voice and had gotten mouthy, explaining as she was doubting that she felt threatened and that no one else was home but her and me. I did not even have butterflies in my belly as I had rummaged in my head to find any culpable act on my part and had come back empty-handed. I felt as if this absence of wrongdoing would protect me during my interactions with the police, but nonetheless something told me to stop communicating with my mom at that point and just wait for the police to arrive. In the meantime, the immediately preceding scene came to mind as follows. It was around 5 in the afternoon. I had sat down at the table in the kitchen where my mom was cooking picadillo. My mom had grimaced and without turning her head from the direction of the stove said in Spanish with annoyance, "Ivan, don't be so rough with things. This place isn't ours, and your dad's going to have to pay for any damage you cause when we move out. You're always too rough with things. And I see why your sisters say you make them frightened with the way you open the door, treat the cabinets, and walk around the apartment. I never hear your sisters make that much noise. It's unnecessary, and it frightens people." I had kept my focus on the object of talking with my mom, and had asked, "Mom, can Omar come over tomorrow?" She had not responded, but instead had gone to a cabinet and had gotten a lid with which to cover the pan. I then said, "Okay, so Omar's coming over tomorrow. I always go over to his house, and he just wants to come over and watch TV for a few hours." My mom had made her voice controlled, monotonous, barely audible, and kept a taciturn look on her face as she parroted back my dad's rationale while holding the cover over the pan of picadillo. "Ivan, you know that you cannot invite your friends over. That is a custom we do not follow." My finger had rolled a breadcrumb over a flower embroidered in the white tablecloth, and I replied with the wounded punctiliousness of a self-interested teen, "That's not true. You've taken me to his house." She had then maintained her taciturn, self-controlled manner and quietly closed off further discussion. "That's it. I'm not going to discuss the matter further with you. I'm too busy." I got mouthy then because I imagined the disappointed look on Omar's face when I would tell him he could not come over, and I said, "How convenient, Mom. The discussion always ends when you say so. That's so unfair. Now I have to tell Omar that he can't come over because we don't follow the custom of going to people's houses. But you've taken me to his house." She had held in her hand the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the picadillo, slanted protectively in front of her, and then looked at me as if a fearsome stranger had suddenly taken my chair at the table, and in her quavering voice weaved together conjecture, assertion, and threat. "Ivan, I don't know what's gotten into you, but you're very altered. If you continue to press the matter in that tone of voice, I'm going to call the police and let them deal with you, because you're making me very uncomfortable with your insistence. I don't know what's gotten into you. Maybe it's because you're drinking too much coffee lately or something else. But I already told you I'm not going to talk any further with you about the matter, and yet you continue to insist on it." I felt injury in my feelings as if caused by the fatigue of paper cuts, different from the humiliation and anger that the big physical punches of my dad would have caused. It was brought by a sense of alienation in her alternation of directness and indirectness, in her alternation of verbal attack and victimization, which struck me as having perhaps as a suitable object, say, some felon, but not me. I was also brought by the feeling that I was expected to swallow reasons that couldn't hold water, was treated dismissively. To top it all off, I found myself subjected to an unfair standard of conduct. A chair would not break by a 13-year-old sitting down on it unless the chair was defective. I had caused no damage to the apartment. The noise she complained of seemed to exist within no other ambit than that of subjective preference. The effect of my conduct she had mentioned struck me as being as accidental to my state of being a boy as her and my sister's alleged inability as women to lug the bag of trash I had to lug downstairs instead was accidental to their alleged state of being women. But no one's subjective preference preference was dictating weight training for them to become like me. Instead, whenever I was sent out at night to pick up a bag of laundry at a laundrette down the block, because allegedly my mom and sister as women did not feel safe doing so and could not lug the bag back home. Those allegations he asserted on the basis of sex settled the matter conclusively. I was to pick up the bag of laundry at night because you're a boy. End of story. In contrast, their subjective preferences were dictating that I was to alter myself to become like them. In this state, a sense had crept up on me, advising me to face my mother's threat, to commit myself to remaining in the chair, as a look of bewilderment invaded my face and I found myself uttering, "The police, Mom? What did I do? Go ahead, call them." She then had reached for the phone and said, "See, that's it, I'm calling them. I'm all alone in this house and you're misbehaving." Soon there was a knock on the door of our apartment. From my chair at the kitchen table, I could see the front door. There was no wall between the kitchen and the immediately adjacent space of the tiny living room that abutted the front door on the opposite side. I could see how my mom opened the door, presented her face at the two policemen in dark blue uniforms, presented a perfunctory smile while she wiped her hands on her white apron, and proceeded to indirectly state that she wished to speak in Spanish. No sé si puedo hablarles en español, oficiales. One of the officers, the first officer of average height, square-shaped, square-faced, square-jawed, square-chinned, black shiny hair, combed to the side with a parting on the left, clean-shaven, bright white teeth, answered her. Sí, señora, si usted prefiere, puede contarme lo que ocurre en español. Yo se lo traduzco a mi compañero. In short, my mother told him in Spanish, "My son is very altered, and I'm alone in the apartment, so I didn't feel safe. I was making food in the kitchen and he came and started a discussion with me. I told him I did not wish to talk further about it and he raised his voice at me. I told him he seemed altered and that I would have to call the police if he did not behave, and then he challenged me to call them." I.e., the summation of her more meandering Spanish, in full. Mi hijo está muy alterado y como nada más estamos yo y él en el apartamento, pues los demás andan en el trabajo y en la escuela, y la pequeña todavía la tengo en casa de la babysitter. Y me parece que la mayor se quedaba hasta tarde en la escuela para asistir a una obra de teatro. Pues como estoy yo sola con el niño, no me he sentido segura teniéndolo aquí conmigo en el estado que les dije. Yo estaba en la cocina preparando la comida. A propósito, no recuerdo si he apagado la estufa. Sí, ahora recuerdo que la apagué antes de llamarles a ustedes. Pues yo estaba preparando la comida y mi hijo se dirigió a la cocina y comenzó a hablar. Le dije que no iba a discutir más con él sobre el asunto y fue entonces cuando él me alzó la voz y se mostró empecinado en el tema, hasta que por fin le dije que lo veía muy alterado y que si seguía con esos modos iba a tener que llamar a la policía. Entonces él me contestó con tono de desafío que llamara a la policía. The first officer asked my mom for my name and she gave it to him. Then that officer gave an accurate translation of my mom's version of events to the second officer. Tall, white but tanned, athletic build, short curly blonde hair, and blue eyes, who had looked at my mom while she spoke as if he had understood what she was saying. The second officer nodded after the translation ended and said in a self-assured voice, "Right, that's what I got too. Just wanted to compare what I got with what you got to see if I missed anything." The second officer then told the first officer, "Why don't you go ahead and explain to her that we're going to talk to her son out here, and then we'd like to talk to her some more. I'll see if I can get her son to come out here." The first officer gave my mom a translation of the second officer's message, and then my mom nodded, looked down, and was about to withdraw into the hallway that was situated in a perpendicular direction to my path to the front door. The door to the kitchen was along that hallway, and I anticipated that my mom would return to the kitchen. But suddenly the first officer asked my mom whether I had gotten aggressive with her. My mom responded in the negative as she said I had never been aggressive towards her and added that I was too rough with things. "Oh no, él nunca me ha agredido. Hoy solo me alzó la voz y me ha parecido que estaba muy alterado al insistir tanto sobre el asunto, cuando uno ya le había dicho que uno no estaba dispuesto a seguir hablando con él sobre ese tema. Y más que nada por desafiarme a que llamara a la policía. Pero de un tiempo para acá es demasiado brusco con las cosas. Llega a casa y sube las escaleras con la bicicleta dando unas pisadas que ya se le ha dicho que un día nos van a llamar la atención los vecinos. En otras ocasiones se acerca a la mesa y deja caer todo su peso en la silla, hasta que se le ha tenido que regañar porque las va a romper. Yo ya le dije que tiene que tratar las cosas con cuidado, que tiene que ser más suave con las cosas. No hace falta tratar tan bruscamente a las cosas. Se puede subir las escaleras sin dar pisotones. A sus hermanas nunca se les ha tenido que advertir que traten las cosas con cuidado." The first officer politely nodded and then translated into English for the second officer. No history of aggressive behavior by her son, said it was mostly the insistent manner and altered state she saw her son in that led to the call, especially the fact he told her defiantly to call the police. She also says that she's been telling her son to be gentler with things because he, comes home stomping as he climbs up the stairs carrying his bike, and then when he takes a seat at the table he just lets his body weight fall on the chair. So she's afraid the neighbors are going to complain or that a chair will break one day. As I looked towards the front door, my mother reinitiated the path towards the kitchen that she had been about to take when she had been interrupted. She was entering the kitchen as the second officer looked towards me as I remained sitting in the metal foldable chair in the kitchen, the back legs of which were just touching the edge of the beginning of the carpeted floor of the living room. I looked at him and he firmly but in a friendly tone said, "Hey Ivan, why don't you come out here for a second, buddy, and let us talk to you for a bit. We want to hear your side of the story your mom already told us a bit about." I said, "Okay," and walked out onto the flat rectangular area situated along the front of the apartment. Our second floor apartment was the only unit on the short leg of the L-shaped apartment building consisting of 2 stories, with 6 6 parking stalls on the street level, lined up in succession beneath the long leg of the L. I glanced at a Mexican neighbor 2 units over who was leaning perilously against the flimsy black railing, who glanced back at me and showed a brief smile under his large black mustache. My eyes then caught sight of an open 12-pack box of Coronas, the beer, visible through the half-open door of his apartment. I found myself envisioning the railing falling off and the man plunging into space, but decided to keep an eye out in case the railing should wobble. And finally, with that in mind, I looked at both police officers standing in front of me. The first officer looked at the second officer as if waiting for his lead, and I accordingly directed myself to the second officer, feeling a warm sense of safety as I met his lucid blue eyes and said, "Hello, officer." He said, "Hey man, why don't you go ahead and tell me what happened earlier with your mom?" I said, "Okay, my friend Omar wants to come over. I asked my mom if I could have him over tomorrow. She said no." I said, "Why not?" She said, "We didn't follow those customs." I said, "But you take me to his house." She said she didn't want to talk about it anymore. I also talked back to her and raised my voice because I then said, "How convenient. You end the discussion whenever you want it to end," or something like that. Then I think she said I was altered and that she was scared. Then she said she would call the police, and I told her to go ahead because I didn't think I did anything wrong. The first officer glanced around as I finished relating my account. The second officer said, "Got it. You were trying to ask your mom if your friend Omar could come over because Omar wants to come over, which is a bit understandable since you go visit him at his house, and your mom seems to let you do that. You raised your voice at her when you pointed out that she's taking you to visit Omar's house, and then again after she said she didn't want to discuss the matter anymore." I nodded affirmatively. He said, "Okay, can you think of anything else that might be going on lately between you and your mom?" I sensed that he was referring to my mom's statements that I seemed altered. I said, "Well, I know she said that I seemed altered, but I don't know where she gets that from. I'm just going to middle school and playing soccer when I'm not in class. Oh yeah, I do like coffee." He said, "Okay, well you're a pretty soft-spoken kid and I'm not really seeing anything alarming in your behavior so far. Your mom told us as well that there's not been a history of aggressiveness towards her by you, so that's good. We want to continue to avoid aggression, you know. We don't want to start threatening to hurt anyone. That's not the way to solve things. You seem like a typical boy in your age group. You probably run around a lot, huh? But your mom deals with you every day and I don't, and she appears to feel that there's a change that worries her about you. I'm not saying she's right or that she's wrong, but that's something she feels. But we're here to make sure everyone's safe and there's no criminal activity. So I want to give you a heads up so everyone's on the same page when I go and talk to your mom now, okay? Let me just say that you're not in trouble with the police. From what your mom has told us and what you've told us, and just evaluating the circumstances here, I think this one is one of those matters that are better handled by someone other than the police. I'm thinking of some resources that I'm going to recommend to your mom so she can follow up with them. The police, we're not experts on parenting, and my word on parenting is no better than your mom's or any other unqualified person's. That said, I get it, man. I get that you want your friend to come over and you're in a hard place telling him he can't visit you when your mom is taking you to visit him. Like I said, there are resources that your mom can take advantage of, so maybe what happened today doesn't happen again. But at the end of the day, it's her house and she makes the rules, and I think you know that. My dad learned that my mom had called the police later when I was sitting in the living room playing a computer game about a war of robots, while my sisters were sprawled out on their bellies on the living room floor in front of the TV, watching their favorite TV program, Anne of Green Gables. I overheard him say in a gentle, pleading voice he had adopted ever since that day he had almost gotten arrested, "I don't know why you had to do that. Why did you need to take it that far? The boy did not mean to scare you, and probably all the neighbors saw the police show up." I also saw and heard my older sister question my dad with an indignantly perplexed look on her face. "Okay, Dad, why did she need to do that? Because he's too loud and rough. Why don't you ask why he needs to be like that? If I were my mom, I would have called the police too. Who cares if the neighbors see the police show up? He needs to learn to control his tone of voice and to be more gentle with things. It's scary to hear him stomping up the stairs, carrying his mountain bike and letting it just drop on the floor outside. And then all that clanging when he chains it up. He sounds like he's an intruder or something." There was the next time that the police paid another visit to that one-bedroom apartment. I was in my second year of high school, around 16 years of age, and I had come home from soccer practice to find my sisters cooking in the kitchen, the youngest one happily helping the other one in the task of whisking batter, on her knees on a chair next to the kitchen table. Before I could head towards the kitchen to make a sandwich, my older sister shouted, "Don't even think of coming in here, Ivan. We're making food." I said, "I'm just going to make a sandwich and get a glass of milk." My older sister appeared at the border between the kitchen and the carpeted space of the living room I was in, holding a spatula as she said, "No, you're not coming in here. Can't you see we're using the kitchen? Go away." She turned away. I raised myself from the chair at the computer at the sound of which she wheeled around and warned, "If you come in here, I'm calling the police because you're threatening me." To which I replied with a puzzled and hungry look, "How am I threatening you? I'm trying to get a sandwich and some milk from the kitchen. I'm hungry, and if my mom were here, she'd tell you to let me get some food." My younger sister, brown-skinned, pudgy form with long, wavy, jet black hair up in a ponytail and quick, curious black eyes, whom my mom always dressed in frocks, capable of evoking sights and smells of tea-time delicate china cups and mini cakes, was absorbed in trying to whisk a bowl of batter, her tongue sticking out from the right corner of her mouth as she struggled to overcome the viscosity of the batter. Slowly, I took a step forward and paused as the older one glared at me. "Ivan, I will call the police. My mom already did it before because you were threatening her, and now you're threatening me. They're not going to let you get away scot-free a second time, She picked up the cordless phone in the kitchen and held it in her hand, pivoting her wrist to and fro, so that the phone spun in front of me, to and fro. I gulped, felt the nausea one feels when one's stomach is empty and swallows saliva. Her body did not cover the entire door opening of the kitchen between the kitchen space and the living room space, and as I walked into the kitchen and towards the fridge, I heard her dialing and then asking in a trembling voice the operator to send the police. My younger sister said brightly, "Hi, Ivan, I'm making a cake." I said, trying to muster enthusiasm to keep her brightness afloat, "And it's gonna be a great cake, huh, Muffin?" There was silence throughout the apartment, except for my little sister's whisking, the rustling her clothes made as she settled back in the creaky, foldable metallic chair to rest, and the page-turning she engaged in with a magazine in the meantime. I made myself a sandwich while my older sister hovered by the door. "They're here," she announced in a firm voice. My younger sister ceased her activity, and a look of expectation came over her face as if under the belief that my parents had come home. I whispered to her, "No, not Mom, the police," and her eyes grew wide. I sat back down in the same chair at the same kitchen table as on the previous time the police were called. I felt flat inside as I looked at my 2 slices of boiled ham between 2 slices of white bimbo bread, and then at my glass of milk, unmoved now to eat or drink, as if water had been poured on that flame. But I forced myself to take a bite from the corner, chew and swallow, almost instantly feeling brighter. I heard my older sister's voice at the front door explain that my parents were at work and then break. I imagined tears in her eyes as she told the 2 police officers. And he came home and I felt very scared because he insisted on coming to the kitchen after I had asked him not to come near me. He's big and loud and always rough with things, so I didn't want him around me. My mom also had to call the police before for the same reason. What if he scares my little sister one day? Hearing her cry melted the hardening feeling I had been experiencing up until then. Under the pressure of quid pro quo, antipathy, confusion, sense of repetition, and worry that I was becoming the pitcher that so often was taken to the well that I was bound to break eventually. At that point, I felt that my executive functions determined that I should simply state the facts, and then resign myself to whatever result the authorities deemed was the right one. After hearing a different voice from the first officer's voice that had governed the conversation so far with my sister, interjecting to inquire whether the stove was off, I heard the first officer's firm voice, the voice of a female police officer, as it punctuated upon my eardrums. "Hey brother, is that you? Brother, would you mind coming out here for a second so we can talk to you? Sis appears to be very upset, and we just want to see if we can clear up the story with you, okay? You're not under arrest or anything like that. We just want to chat, hear your side of the story." I found myself quickly, as if all at once, taking in the sight of her reddish brown and smooth hair in a ponytail, short and stout body, pinkish white skin spotted with hundreds of medium-sized reddish freckles, her ruddy face with a bright, gray-eyed gaze. I felt reassured by the tone of her commanding voice and by the sense that she was following a process familiar to me from the previous time. I answered, "Okay," and approached them, seeing for the first time that she was accompanied by another white police officer, who was also wearing a dark blue uniform and who gave me a pursed-lipped smile and a nod as I stepped outside. The second officer was blonde-haired, brown-eyed, and thin, and I felt that the name displayed on her silver bar-like name badge, J. McDonald, suited her well, guessing that her first name could be Jennifer. The first officer, A. Lewis, according to her name badge, said, "Looks like you've been doing some running. You play football?" I said, "Oh, my soccer jersey. Yeah, I just got back home from soccer practice." She said, "Oh, soccer, great. So tell me what happened when you got home from soccer practice today." Feeling that neither ampleness of time nor restriction of time existed for my exposition, I stated, "Well, I got home hungry from soccer practice. My sisters were cooking in the kitchen, but I just wanted a sandwich and thought I could squeeze in there and make one. My older sister first told me I couldn't go in the kitchen. I tried to go in anyway, and she said she would call the police. I was hungry and saw that there was room for me to make a sandwich, so I went in and made myself a sandwich, and she called the police." Officer Lewis said, "Okay, so you got home hungry from soccer practice, saw there was enough room for you to grab a sandwich from the kitchen without getting in the way of your sisters who were cooking, but your older sister told you not to go in there, and you did, and she called the police. Can you think of anything else you might want to add to that?" I said, "No, that's all I did." She said, "Okay, Officer McDonald, do you want to add anything?" Officer McDonald said, "I think I've got brother's side of this story. Before I circle back to sister and see if she has anything to add though, I wanted to ask if there were any threats of physical force." At that point I said, "No, I didn't threaten to use physical force against her, and she didn't threaten me either with anything like that." Officer McDonald then said, "Okay, that's what I was concerned about. Your sister didn't mention that, but it's important to clear that up. We want to make sure we're not scaring anyone with physical force, okay, brother? Alright, why don't you just hang tight here for a few minutes. I'll touch base with your sister, and then I'll have you join us in a bit." As I waited at the foot of the stairwell, I heard my sister cry again at the front door, which was set back about 2 meters from the top of the stairs. As she spoke to them by the front door, I heard her tear-cracked voice. "I just want to be able to be left alone in the kitchen when I'm baking. I don't like having him around me. I'm not comfortable. He's loud and rough. Even my mom called the police on him before because he scared her." Then I heard Officer Lewis's voice as she turned around towards me and said, "Okay, brother, do you want to join us? You guys are old enough to be home alone without your parents, so I'm not worried about that, and it appears that there was no physical violence or threat of physical violence, so that reassures me. Brother seems calm, and sis says he doesn't have a history of physical violence or threats of violence. I definitely do not want to give the impression to you, sister, that you cannot call the police. You can call the police. That said, what happened here today appears to be, a sibling squabble, and the police are not the best suited people to deal with that. I've left resources is with you, sister, that I want you to give your parents. Some family counseling could be much more helpful than the advice I'm going to give you guys today as we wrap up here. So show your parents that information. Sister, I understand you were using the kitchen, and in a perfect world, no one would disturb you in there. But we don't live in a perfect world, and it sounds like brother could have made himself a sandwich with minimal disturbance to you, other than that of seeing him in there. I sympathize with you, but it would have taken brother, 5 minutes to make his sandwich and get out of your way? It's part of being human. We have to eat when we're hungry. My sister had a pained look on her face as she registered Officer Lewis's words, who proceeded to say, "Okay, now after we leave, you two are not going to get into another argument, are you, brother?" I said, "No, officer, I made my sandwich already." My sister said with a compensating manner, "Like I always do, I'll leave him alone and want him to leave me alone." Officer Lewis said, "All right, sis, be careful cooking." Chapter 3. Growing Pains. I find that the challenges during the period encompassed by elementary school at one end and college at the other are like a call and response. The former period set up challenges I would struggle to overcome successfully in the latter. The period encompassed by elementary school on one end to my graduation from high school at the other end has presented me with painful experiences pertaining to exclusion related to the status of being Spanish speaking and the limitations in accessing resources with which that exclusion coincided, including access to resources conducive to college-bound preparedness. I've also found that my college experiences indicate that I fought to keep open the doors the lack of those resources would have shut, specifically doors to self-development. This self-development included the analytical development imparted by the study of the natural sciences, chemistry, biology, math, physics, included the hard-won recovery of my Spanish native tongue, and the enrichment activity of volunteering at a prestigious local hospital. After all, the idea that exclusion can be painful will strike few as far-fetched, as much was noted in passing by the late Justice Felix Frankfurter in his concurrence in Heresites v. Shaughnessy, in which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld deportation orders arising from membership in the Communist Party, in significant part due to limitations on the court's ability to inquire into matters deemed to be entrusted to the political branches of government, including Congress. As he added that, whether immigration laws have been crude and cruel, whether they may have reflected xenophobia in general, or anti-Semitism, or anti-Catholicism, the responsibility belongs to Congress. Courts do enforce the requirements imposed by Congress upon officials in administering immigration laws, and the requirement of due process may entail certain procedural observances, but the underlying policies of what classes of aliens shall be allowed to enter and what classes of aliens shall be allowed to stay are for Congress exclusively to determine, even though such determination may be deemed to offend American traditions. Citation: Heresites v. Shaughnessy, 342 U.S. 580, 597, 1952. That is, because the term cruel is not usually understood to refer to painless aspects of experience, the idea that exclusion can be painful can be found in the observations of a very sober member of the U.S. Supreme Court named Justice Felix Frankfurter, himself an Austrian American. Moreover, as I find my experiences have shown me, language is a key to communication between people and the worlds of those people, a common experience that has not eluded the enriching history of American jurisprudence. Thus, in Wilson v. Girard, a U.S. soldier, Girard found himself subject to the jurisdiction of Japanese law in a controversy arising from his role in causing the death of a Japanese woman while in the military, as the U.S. Supreme Court left his fate to the political arrangement that had been determined by the executive and legislative branches of government, as stated in accordance with Public Law 777 of the 84th Congress. The United States government will pay for counsel chosen by Girard to defend him in his trial. Pursuant to the administrative agreement under the Japanese treaty, Girard will be guaranteed a prompt trial, the right to have representation by counsel satisfactory to him, full information as to all charges against him, the right to confront all witnesses, the right to have his witnesses compelled to attend court, the right to have a competent interpreter, the right of communication with United States authorities, and the presence of a United States representative as an official observer at the trial. This observer is required to report to United States authorities on all aspects of the trial and the fairness of the court proceedings. Citation: Wilson v. Girard, 354 U.S. 524, 547, 1957. That is, in relevant part, Girard found his future in the hands of the linguistic ability of himself and his advocates to communicate with the political and legal worlds of the Japanese. It is also unsurprising, as unsurprising it strikes me based on my experiences with the matter, that a person in the U.S. who cannot speak English fluently could be subject to exclusion from employment other than employment in low-paying work. It is further unsurprising that these limited job prospects could keep that person at a weakened socioeconomic status. This common experience is not without parallel in American jurisprudence, because the U.S. Supreme Court recognized that parallel in the landmark case of Gideon v. Wainwright, when it stated that any person hailed into court who is too poor to hire a lawyer cannot be assured a fair trial unless counsel is provided for him. Citation: Gideon v. Wainwright, 372 U.S. 335, 344, 1963. That is, similarly to the inability of a person who is not conversant in the dominant language in the U.S. to access the basic tools with which to succeed in society, so too a person who lacks the means of conversance in the law will be unable to access the basic tools with which to succeed in the judicial system. Thus, it is unsurprising that a person, such as a parent in the US, who lacks English fluency, could be restricted in his or her ability to access the basic tool of a decent paying job required to succeed in American society. In the above light, it is also unsurprising that with that weakened socioeconomic status, access to resources conducive to preparedness for post-secondary education will not exactly abound to the extent that they do with the more affluent socioeconomic status, as I have found to have occurred in my case. Thus, this unsurprising negative link between weakened socioeconomic status and the attainment of a state deemed sufficient to undertake higher education has already appeared in landmark cases in American jurisprudence. For example, in Grutter v. Bollinger, in which the U.S. Supreme Court set forth several requirements that must be met to keep an affirmative action, race-conscious, public law school admissions policy narrowly drawn enough to remain on the right side of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That link appeared like a silent scream in Dr. Rodenbusch predicted that if race were not considered, only 10% of those applicants would have been admitted. Under this scenario, underrepresented minority students would have comprised 4% of the entering class in 2000, instead of the actual figure of 14.5%. Citation, Grutter v. Bollinger, 539 U.S. 306, 320, 2003. That is, compared to non-minority, non-underrepresented students, only 4% of minority underrepresented students would be deemed sufficiently ready to undertake a program of higher learning, such as law school, without affirmative action, an already eyebrow-raising figure in the 2000s, whereas there were enough applicants so that 14.5% could be admitted, but only under compensatory race-conscious considerations that would not have been necessary if those applicants had been deemed as having at least the same degree of sufficiency for that program of higher learning as their non-minority, not underrepresented counterparts. The relative difficulties for these latter students to access resources conducive to academic sufficiency compared with their non-minority, non-underrepresented counterparts that can be found in Bollinger regarding a high level of post-secondary education such as law school does not necessarily become inconsequential at lower levels of post-secondary education, because there too, students compete with one another for admission, and thus relative difficulties in accessing those resources that make some more academically sufficient than others are not rendered inconsequential. Additionally, there is nothing earth-shattering about the ideas that on the one hand, college is an opportunity for self-development, and that on the other hand, success in college is subject to college readiness. Consequently, it is unsurprising that with under-resourced college preparedness, clipped are the wings of the student seeking the self-development that college offers. To attain that self-development, he or she could then find him or herself, as I found myself doing, having to do a formidable amount of flapping of those appendages. From elementary school to high school. My elementary school experiences began with Luis Ortega, a round-faced, brown-skinned, curly-haired Mexican 6-year-old, and my first brief opportunity at friendship in Northern California, specifically in Redwood City, a city located in the Northern Bay Area region of California, where my schooling continued from the first grade of elementary school. The English as a Second Language, ESL, teachers, whose classes I had taken inside a portable classroom during the 3 hours a day during kindergarten that I would be separated from my homeroom class for that purpose, had been thrilled with my progress. They had told my mom that they had been shocked by the sponge-like way that I had absorbed English in the course of only one academic year, at the end of which I was already communicating with them in English. Based on that observation, they had strongly advised against placing me in a separate English as a Second Language program in my future school. However, I still did not speak English as my preferred language, and continued to speak to my parents in Spanish until around the time I began second grade in elementary school. Now residing in Redwood City, my parents had hired Luis's mother, La Señora Avila, to babysit my sister and me. We were dropped off at her apartment at 6 a.m. and she would drive us to school at around 8 a.m. since class started at 8:30 a.m. The mornings of that first week of first grade blend together in the regularity of their starkness, beginning with the interactions between Luis and his parents, all three of them monolingual Spanish speaking. Again, at around 7:15 a.m., La Señora Avila, in stark contrast to the quiet Oaxacan indigenous woman demeanor she presented to the rest of the world, broke into another round of swearing and enjoining him to get out of bed and get ready for school. Luis, que te levantes ya. Si te lo tengo que decir una vez más, lo vas a sentir, cabrón. Alístate ya para llevarte a la escuela, que ya tienes a esos niños esperándote aquí desde las 6. Their apartment had 2 tiny bedrooms, the doors of which were visible from the living room. Luis's room could be seen while sitting on the sofa. The other could be seen after I had adjusted to the cartoon channel, the knob of the TV, about 5 steps across from the sofa, and then tilted my head to the right as I was about to return to the sofa. Coming from the second bedroom, Luis's dad's face flashed in the hallway, stern, pale, pockmarked, beneath a head of thinning black hair, and appearing to be a product of malnutrition, alcoholic excess, and stress. I meekly said in Spanish, "Good morning, Mr. Avila," and my sister followed suit. Buenos dias, Señor Avila. He grunted, buenos dias, and disappeared into the bathroom as my eyes returned to watching Scooby-Doo and eating my cereal. Luis appeared after his shower as I was watching another rerun of Scooby-Doo and hurriedly slurped down the bowl of cereal his mom plopped down in front of him, with the admonition, date prisa para comer, niño, que quedan 15 para las 8. Luis's dad emerged into the living room dressed in a well-worn black leather jacket, well-worn white dress shirt, and black polyester pants that drooped down sadly towards his black faded dress shoes, ready to leave to his job at a diner where he worked as a dishwasher, before parting without addressing his spouse other than to rebuff the lunch she had packed for him and tell her that he would grab something at work. He wagged a menacing finger at Luis and told him that if he got a call from a teacher, God himself could not save Luis from what he would have coming to him, as he was sick of his mischief. Escúchame bien, Luis, pórtate bien. Como te metas en más problemas, no hay Dios que te libre de la que te va a caer. Me tienes harto ya de tus trastadas. Even with my frame of reference of Mexico and my own dad's erratic violence as to the environment in which kids were raised, I felt in need of an explanation to get my bearings at Luis's home, which Luis matter-of-factly gave me in simplified self-serving version in Spanish, to the effect that people around here just don't like me, and they blabber things to my dad. Chris Lochner starts fights with me all the time, and then when I whoop him, the white people yell at my dad. That is, es que los vecinos me tienen ojeriza, y por cualquier cosa van de chismosos a mi papá. Y el Chris Lochner, que siempre me busca bronca, pero luego se la parto y los gringos van a reclamarle a mi papá. But that explanation was incomplete. Luis lived a block from the train tracks, which had a significant presence of Latino gangs, an impoverished residential neighborhood situated between and parallel to the train tracks and the back of a row of liquor stores and adult bookstores and several taquerias that lined the main road. The intervening grid of streets was littered with abandoned cars, decrepit mobile homes, and prematurely steely-eyed kids who would cease playfighting amongst themselves to glare down passing cars, unsupervised at all hours. Streets in which Luis, too, had been running around unsupervised, stealing, and getting into fights, including with the neighbor across the street, Chris Lochner. It was 8 a.m. when I found myself going down the stairs on the outside of the apartment building next to Luis, following to her car Luis's mom, who held my sister's hand. As Luis talked to me in Spanish about playing street soccer, I listened in silence and suddenly heard English words I sensed were unfriendly, although I did not understand their content, only the aggressive sounds injected into them by their source suggesting dislike, as they were spat out from across the street in the direction of Luis and me. Hey Beaner! I saw a tall white kid, his fierce eyes focused on Luis. His heavy-set corpulence matched his British bulldog face. He tensely leaned like a wound spring on the metallic woven wire fence that separated his front lawn from the sidewalk. The kid spat out again with a hate-filled look trained on Luis, as if I didn't exist. Luis the Beaner. Hey Luis the Beaner, did he eat beans today? Haha. Luis yelled back with a similar venom in his heavily Spanish accented voice. Shut up, Pat Chris. Luis's mother told Luis to get in the car or he was going to make us late. Even from the distance of a street's width, I was shaken by the hostility of the exchange and did not look forward to meeting Chris from any smaller distance. But as was Luis, Chris was in my first grade class. Luis and I were the only two Spanish-speaking kids because at that time in the academic year, Jose Tejeda had not yet arrived. Of the several times that Chris and Luis were taken to the principal's office for fighting during the first 2 months of school, in which I was able to become familiar with Luis, I managed to steer clear of Chris by staying off to one side and not opening my mouth most of the time. Chris had looked past me until then the way some lions seem to look through safari vehicles until these approached too closely. However, the one time I came too close and said excuse me in Spanish, i.e. con permiso, absent-mindedly trying to get around Chris to get to the crayons. Chris's usual gaze of indifference as to me suddenly became that of the man-eating lion with a human in its sights. Chris, who from up close appeared to be twice my size, then said, Luis the Beaner's little Beaner friend, and slammed his fist into my chest and sent me stumbling backwards. The teacher saw that because she towered next to me suddenly as I rose to my feet. She faced Chris angrily, hand on hip, another hand pointing towards the door, and said, Chris, go to the principal's office now. I walked back to my seat confused in my feelings towards the teacher because this was the same teacher who sometimes inspired my dislike by calling Luis, and only Luis, pig, even oinking at him when she had caught Luis with others, taking an extra cookie, extra slice of pizza, or extra slice of cake on the occasion of the in-class party of the kid whose birthday happened to be that day. Later in those first 2 months in the school corridors, I found myself among the bustling stream of students like salmon swimming upstream, separated from Luis. As I rounded the corner of the E-wing, I found myself staring without knowing it at Chris's large, square chest in front of my nose, as I frantically tried to resist the inertia that would lead me to strike my nose against it and to recoil apologetically. Perdón, fue sin querer. I again felt Chris's lead-like hands slamming against my chest in the midst of his loud, fuck you, Beaner, and flinging me backwards until I found myself sprawled on my back. As I collected myself, I could see that Luis had appeared. A yard duty aide finally broke up the ensuing fight between the two by throwing her body against Chris and finally knocking Chris off from his position astride the abdomen of Luis, who had been pinned against the ground. He had squirmed and struggled to, but had not been able to avoid Chris's grabbing his hair and causing the back of his head to forcefully hit the pavement several times. As the teacher who had arrived by then looked at Luis's pupils, Luis giggled giggled oddly, swallowed with pain on his face, and looked dazed. I found myself being directed away from the scene, thinking nervously about the warning that Luis's father had given him not too long ago, and had already implemented several times since then with a belt, after which Luis had flinched when I touched his back. I was not told then why Luis's mom stopped babysitting for me, or why Luis did not return to class after that day, or why from one day to the next my parents instead dropped off my sister and me at 6 a.m. on school days at one of the wooden benches that were situated alongside the back of the school building, facing a row of shadowy redwood trees that lined the tall wooden fences of the luxurious neighboring houses. The school year was 3/4 of the way through when Jose Tejeda appeared in my first grade class, a dark-skinned Mexican from Michoacan with a striking resemblance to Cantinflas, i.e. the Mexican actor Mario Moreno, a resemblance that would become even more pronounced as early as 5th grade when thin, dark whiskers sprouted on each side of his upper lip. He was presented to the class as a new student, and the teacher assigned him a seat next to me. "Jose, why don't you go sit next to Ivan? He speaks Spanish too." "Ivan, I'm assigning Jose to you. He doesn't speak any English yet, so I want you to help him out, okay?" Jose looked small in front of the class and bashful as the center of attention as the teacher restrained him with a hand on his shoulder, while forgetfully moving on to talk about a bake sale. Eventually, he took a seat next to me, and he lost no time in showing a biting side he had kept well hidden, while standing bashfully at the front of the classroom, making assertions and asking about my name, my place of birth, my opinion of the professor, giving his opinion of the professor. All of that in short, quick, chummy spurts, as if filled with restless energy. "¿Qué hubo, güero? Soy José. ¿Y tú cómo te llamas? ¿Iván? ¿De dónde eres? Pareces gringo. ¿Tama o qué? ¿De México o no? Yo soy de Michoacán. Oye, ¿cae bien esta profesora? A mí no. Me cae gorda. Yo ya tenía ganas de buscar un asiento y la gorda no paraba de hablar de no sé qué. ¿Qué dijo de mí? Parece que lo hubieran dado cuerda." I whispered responses to his questions in Spanish, but I first glanced around at the seats in the classroom. These were arranged in 4 columns of 4 rows. Nearest to the only door and on the opposite side of the windows, a student named Harry sat to my right in the last row, row 4. Jose Tejeda, also sitting in the last row, sat to my left. Chris Lochner and his friends were clustered together in the second row, from the front of the class, and right by the wall opposite the door. There was a time during class that was devoted to reading aloud the book we happened to be reading. Harry Walker, who sat to my right along the back row of the classroom, struck me like the poster child of Anglo-American childhood, with his blue eyes, blonde hair, white skin, fluent American English, peppered with phrases like burn rubber and running pell-mell. His parents were an Anglo-American, Arizona-born father and a white-skinned, Arizona-born mother, whom I would later meet. Today, Harry read aloud, and the teacher stifled a giggle as he dramatically, theatrically, waved his hands and jumped, declaiming with a piping castrata voice. So all we could do was to sit, 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 sit. I myself enjoyed the animation that Harry brought to reading Dr. Seuss aloud. After Jose Tejeda had been assigned to me, Harry became the first Anglo-American kid who befriended me, and whom I befriended, while some students in the class threw crumpled papers during his impassioned reading aloud, or as Harry later said on at least one occasion, if not more, crying inconsolably, pegged him with a spitball. I found myself whispering his name inspiritingly. "Harry." One day I found myself assigned to take him to the school nurse next to the principal's office, down the hall after a spitball had struck his eye. Afterward, Harry uttered, "You want to play on the merry-go-round?" Soon after, Harry shouted, "Oui," as I hopped up on the merry-go-round with him, which was the first time I had heard an American English exclamation up close. But it sounded especially apt then, and I said "we" too for the first time. As school was ending that day, I was standing in the double file that we students were made to stand in before stopping by our student cubbies on the way out from class and collecting our belongings. Harry stood next to me and said amiably, "Do you know how to swim? If you come over, we can go swimming." By this point in the academic year after class, I usually would head to the school gate to wait with my sister to be picked up by a lady whom my mom had insisted on hiring, saying that she could not have my sister walking home. But I forgot about that routine when I heard swimming, and filled with a satisfying sense of expectation of making a new friend, I said, "Okay," without giving any thought to the fact that I had no swimming trunks, that I didn't know where Harry lived, did not know how I would get home afterwards, and did not know what my parents or sister would have to say about my deviation from my usual itinerary. It was a hot day, and I walked into Harry's home, which was situated within a gated community immediately next to the school, and which greeted me with a cool blast of lavender-scented air and the natural beauty of 4 large memoirs of his parents' travels. Huge boulders of amethyst, cut open to reveal their cragged, glossy, purple, crystalline flesh, standing majestically upon black square platforms that themselves rested on an oriental rug, underlain by a dust-free, polished, dark brown hardwood floor. Harry had his own bedroom. He gave me a pair of swim trunks, a pair of wine-colored shorts that reached my knees with a soft white mesh lining inside. He said to wait for a second because he was going upstairs to get permission from his dad to go swimming. With Harry in tow, his dad appeared at the door to Harry's bedroom a few minutes later, a tall 40-ish Anglo-American man with an amiable lawyer demeanor, a road cyclist's lean body, tanned skin that on his face had acquired a reddish hue imparted by his taste for several glasses of expensive wine at dinner, a head of shortish, silky, dirty blonde hair, and a style reminiscent of John F. Kennedy's, and soft blue eyes. With an amiable but firm voice, he said, "Hello, I'm Mark, Harry's dad. Very nice to meet you, Ivan. Harry tells me that you know how to swim, is that right? Good. Well, I just wanted to come down here and tell you boys, in case you need anything, that I'll be keeping an eye out from my office upstairs. Be careful, and if anything comes up, you know where to find me. Okay, what else? It looks like you've got swim trunks. I think that's it. Harry, get Ivan to tell. Alright, boys. I'm making dinner tonight, so why don't you stay for dinner, Ivan? And we can get to know each other more later." We had been swimming in his pool, which was neither too hot nor too cold, for a half hour, when I ceased moving upon hearing his mom's sing-song voice asking if any of the home's usual occupants were there. "Mark? Harry? Diana? I'm home." Her radiance struck me as the sliding glass door to the pool opened and she stepped outside. Her flowing blonde, silky hair, pale freckled skin, her tropical-themed indigo-colored dress, with two toucans imprinted on it, cinched by a blue ribbon of matching satin that narrowed the soft, flowing fabric at her waist, her bright red lipstick, and her translucent, somewhat iridescent blue eyes. With a flowing, light-hearted, and friendly intonation, she uttered, "Well, hello, young man. I'm Harry's mom. And who might you be?" "Ivan. That's a nice name." "Well, I'm happy to have you here, Ivan. The only thing, dear, is I'm afraid your mom's not going to be too happy with me if I allow you to keep swimming without sunscreen. Look how red your little shoulders are. Why don't you come out of the water so I can put some sunscreen on you? Harry, sweetheart, why didn't you make sure your friend had sunscreen? Remember, Harry, we're working on showing care to others. This is one way to show care to others, okay? So next time, what are we going to do, Harry?" "Yes, we're going to make sure others have sunscreen." As she applied sunscreen, I felt a heady satisfaction at the coconut smell and her reassuringly warm manner. "Okay, dear, I want this to be a learning experience for you too. You and I have very pale skin, so I can tell you that people like you and I must always wear sunscreen before we expose ourselves to the sun for any period of time. You know, by the time your skin has already turned red, the damage has already happened. Okay, so in the future, what are we going to do?" "Yes, good, we're going to apply sunscreen before going out into the sun." Before she went inside the house, she said, "Harry, dear, what's the game plan for you boys today? Is Ivan staying for dinner, spending the night, or what?" Harry thought for a second and came back with, "Oh yeah, Dad said he's making dinner and we're all eating dinner together. But he said we'd talk more later. I want Ivan to spend the night." Harry's mom said, "In that case, I need to make sure that we've touched base with Ivan's mom. Ivan's welcome here, but does Ivan's mom know that he's here?" "Okay, you two, judging by those shrugs and looks, I'm going to take that as a no." "Oh dear, your poor mom's going to be worried sick about you when she can't find you and doesn't know where you are." "Alright, here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to spoil your fun. What I need to do is call Ivan's mom, let her know Ivan's safe, and get her okay about his staying here tonight." My mother has since confirmed that she spoke to Harry's mom on the phone at work by taking a 15-minute break to do so from her work as a cook at the pharmaceutical that was then called Syntex, although she cannot recall whether she was reached by way of the school or directly by way of my giving Harry's mom her work phone number, as a precaution that my mom had already taken as early as the time that I was in kindergarten. She had written down our address, home phone number, and my parents' work phone number in the school folder I was bought at the start of each year. My mother was dismayed because she was struck by the thought that it was extremely dangerous on my part to go into the home of a stranger whereupon I could have been kidnapped and held for ransom. She had felt like going immediately to pick me up, but Harry's mom had diffused her concerns enough to let me stay for dinner, but not spend the night, by presenting herself not only as the mother of a child in my class, but also as the owner of a local business that she named, and as a member of the school's parent-teacher association. Then Harry's mother had handed the phone to me so I could tell my mom that I wanted to stay. My mother had said that we would talk later with my father about my deviation from the prescribed itinerary, and then Harry's mom had wrapped up by telling my mom that she'd drive me home herself and have me home by 8:30 p.m. Harry's dad made brick oven pizza and grilled filet mignon. As he drank a glass of wine, he told me to get more than the thin slice of pizza that I had shyly limited myself to taking, and placed a medallion of filet mignon on my plate. During dinner, Harry's mom told her husband that I'd probably enjoy it if they included me in their outings, as she presented a sample of these: Yosemite, the San Francisco Opera, charity events associated with the philanthropy of Harry's parents, swimming and tennis at their country club, and so on. Harry's dad nodded and added, "I'm sure he'd love cycling. We could do road cycling or mountain biking. If he hasn't seen it, he'd probably have a great time at Bear Basin on a mountain bike." And then he asked me, "Ivan, what do you think about cycling with Harry and me on the weekend?" "I think this weekend we'll take the road bikes up to Portola Valley. I've got a couple of spare ones that I think you're the right size for. We can stop in Woodside later and have lunch at Buck's." When Harry's mom pulled up at around 8:30 p.m. in the driveway of the L-shaped two-story apartment building, of which our second-floor apartment was the only one on the short leg, my mom appeared at the door, smiled politely, and came downstairs, pointing at an empty stall in which Harry's mom could park. My mom saw me and frowned and shook her head, but quickly focused on Harry's mom, as she apologized for the inconvenience I had caused her, thanked her for contacting her at work, apologized for her small apartment, and invited Harry's mom inside to take some recently made tamales that my mom had set aside for her. Harry's Harry's mom met all my mom's apologies with a friendly laugh and said she was glad to meet her in person, that I was no trouble at all, and that she loved kids, and that she loved treating Harry's friends like her own kids. These tamales were sweet, pink-colored dessert tamales with raisins that my mother had made during Easter, and had now toasted them for Harry's mom, whom she referred to as Senora Walker, even though she had been asked to call her Amy. She had whipped up a thick, satisfying hot cornmeal-based beverage of nut-flavored sweet atole to go with the tamales. Harry's mom said she'd try a bit of a tamale with a cup of atole because she had just had dinner, but as she had chewed and taken a sip of atole, she had rounded her eyes and then said both were delicious. Then she had finished her tamale and cup of atole and placed a dozen in a bundle near her, along with a quart of atole that my mom had poured into a Rubbermaid brand container for her. My father appeared in the kitchen and greeted Harry's mom like my mom had, as though they were reading their lines from the same script, except for the offer of tamales. My father quickly indicated that I was to go to the room, so I thanked Harry's mom and went to the room. From there, however, I could hear them talking until nearly 10 p.m. There had been a to and fro of my parents' broken English and of Ms. Walker's paraphrasing into her proper English, followed by my parents affirming the latter's correctness, that had ended at that time. My mom had given her consent to Harry's mom's plans, including adding me to Harry's sailing lessons, taking me to the San Francisco Opera, taking me with them to the church on Sundays, cycling excursions to charity events hosted by Harry's mom, taking me to their country club, and signing me up with the Boy Scouts of America. Sometimes my parents accepted invitations from Harry's parents after to join them at an event, and thus my parents and Harry's could be seen sometimes seated together in the lounge chairs of the country club, at a church pew on Sunday, at a seat at a music concert, and so on. While I talked to Jose Tejeda at school over the years leading up to 6th grade, the year in which I transferred to middle school, rarely did I talk to Jose Tejeda and Harry together. Other times I would talk to Jose Tejeda included during the summer, times in which he would show up at my apartment building and tell me that others were headed to play soccer at the school that was right next to Harry's house. However, during the early occasions on which Harry also joined the kids who had gathered to play soccer there, one day Harry, who was playing goalie, held the ball and shifted uneasily under the loud implorations of Jose Tejeda, a forward. Jose wanted Harry to kick the ball further afield from the goal instead of rolling it with his hand near the goal to the defenders, like me. Impatient that the other side's forwards were intercepting the ball and scoring goals that way. Harry, tienes que hacer los saques más fuertes y con el pie para hacer que el balón llegue a la delantera. Esas sacaditas enclenques que haces con la mano no sirven. El balón apenas tiene impulso para llegar a la defensa. Se lo estás poniendo a tiro a los delanteros del otro equipo para que lo agarren y nos están metiendo una goliza. Finally, Harry looked at me and said, "Tell him I don't know what he's saying because I don't know Spanish, and I'm not going to want to play anymore if he's going to yell at me the whole time in Spanish." Walking alongside Jose Tejeda towards the drinking fountains had further given rise to the uncomfortable scene of Harry's dawdling alone behind us. Near the end of 3rd grade, Harry had invited me to play baseball with him, so I told Jose Tejeda I couldn't play soccer that day with other friends he had made by then, including kids who only spoke Spanish and looked like Jose, Manuel Ortega, Martin Moreno, and Ociel Navarro. When I asked Harry, "Can Jose Tejeda come play baseball?" Harry had shifted his body uneasily. "Well, no, because there aren't enough bats for all 3 of us. Besides, my mom doesn't let me play with more than one friend at a time," which did not exactly match the fact that I had previously played with Harry together with a Franco-American kid and this kid's brother. However, it was also true that Harry and I most often could be found together as a lone pair by that time. We could be found taking turns practicing hitting and pitching, or alternating between taking penalty shots and playing goalie, or exploring together as a pair on our bikes. There had also been the talent show incident. There had been a talent show at which Jose Tejeda and I had collaborated together to present a very rudimentary magic mime show, using a fishing line to attempt to show that Jose had the power to empty people's pockets without physical contact. Jose and I had silently gotten on the stage. He gestured towards my pants pocket, to the inside of which one end of the thin fishing line had been tied, and indicated that he wanted money by rubbing his fingers together. I shook my head in the negative as if refusing to give him money. He then hovered his left hand over me while moving his lips as if saying an incantation, and then with his right hand, to which was fastened the other end of the fishing line, he had steadily caused the left pocket of my pants to be pulled inside out by pulling on the fishing line, revealing a folded up $1 bill. A polite round of applause ensued. Harry had then sung an a cappella routine with a Franco-American kid and this kid's brother. Jose Tejeda had clapped me on the back and was asking in Spanish what the prize was, as he laughed after he optimistically predicted we'd win. "Bueno, vamos a ganar. ¿Cuál es el premio que le dan al ganador del concurso?" Harry's mom appeared while searching for Harry at that moment and paused. I said in English, "Hi, Ms. Walker." She glanced at Jose Tejeda with a flattened expression on her face and quickly measured him from head to toe and from toe to head. Jose's broad Cantinflas-like smile remained undiminished as he watched her, black eyes twinkling with curiosity, and said, half to me, half to her, "¿Es la mamá del Harry? Pregúntale a ver si sabe cuál es el premio que se le da al ganador." With her usual breathless manner, Harry's mom turned her gaze to me, broke into a smile as if Jose didn't exist, but subtly precluded the possibility of Jose's tagging along anywhere, and said, "Hello, my little magician. I'm trying to find Harry. If you see him, tell him I'm looking for him. Don't forget, you two have a scout meeting at 7 tonight, so come home with Harry after school, and I'll drive you boys to the meeting from there." I nodded in agreement as she pointedly added, "But Ivan, it's just gonna be you and Harry at home today, okay, dear? There's only room in the car for you two anyway. Okay, bye now. Bye-bye." With that, she hurriedly walked away as if whisked away on a magical flying carpet. Shortly after that episode, Jose Tejeda Tejeda expressed his interest in the Boy Scouts again, asking what it was that Harry and I did there, and lamenting the absence of an invitation for him to come along, and predicting what Boy Scouting was about. Bueno, y eso de los Boy Scouts, ¿qué es? La mamá del Harry los lleva a ti y a él a unas reuniones, ¿y qué más? También nos llevan a acampar y de excursión y tal, ¿no? Qué malo eres, que ni siquiera me invitas. Ándale, no te hagas de rogar. Dile al Harry que también yo voy. He had said to not make him beg for an invitation. I told him the truth, that Harry's mom had handled the pertinent matters on my behalf, which I learned much later had included presenting my mom and dad with the forms they had to fill out, talking to the other boys' parents about financial assistance for me, and then telling my dad not to worry about fees or expenses for now, because the parents in the troop had put together a fund, out of which my fees and expenses would be paid. Jose looked downcast, said to forget it, sounded bitter suddenly, and predicted that in that case, she'd probably not want to do the same for him. Oh no, entonces no, mejor olvídalo. No va a querer la pájara hacer lo mismo por mí. Por ti sí, porque a los gringos les caes bien, con esa pinta que tienes de gringo. ¿Te acuerdas cómo me miró la pájara de reojo cuando el concurso de talento? Como recelando. No importa, me la pelan estos gringos. Eventually, Jose Tejeda could only rarely be found with me, and instead, most often could be found with other brown-skinned Spanish-speaking kids. Kids like Manuel Ortega, Martín Moreno, and Ociel Navarro. An influx of brown-skinned, monolingual Spanish-Mexican kids to the school's quiet, affluent surroundings at the border of Redwood City and Atherton. Sometimes I would see the four of them brazenly leave the school premises long before school ended, seemingly without care that anyone might catch them, heading towards their neighborhood about 2 miles away, by the train tracks, the same neighborhood in which I had watched Scooby-Doo reruns while waiting for Luis to get ready for school. I myself spent a lot of my spare time growing up with Harry, absorbed in a different world, as I could be found with him outside of school, near the artificial lake of his gated community, parking our bikes. His father had given me a road bike and a mountain bike, and then remaining at the shoreline, our bottoms on our heels as we watched the tadpoles and insects along the shoreline, or setting out on a Sunday morning for a weekend road cycling tour on our bicycles throughout Atherton and the nearby city of Menlo Park, and then stopping by the side of a quiet residential road to eat our quesadillas with grilled zucchini that Harry's mom had placed in our backpacks that morning, or enjoying a day of swimming, playing tennis, and eating at his parents' country club, or more naughtily, getting into mischief, such as the time we pretended that a mobile home parked near a driveway was haunted, dared each other to open the door, had started playing rocks, paper, scissors near the door to determine who would open the door, and then, after the door had surprised us by swinging open suddenly, and the middle-aged occupant shouted, "Hey!" we had pedaled pell-mell and screaming on our bikes. On the fleeting occasions on which Jose Tejeda's paths and mine would cross, however, I sensed that Jose was on a path that was hardening him, even before the time I saw him get on a bus, walking with a swagger, wearing baggy blue-colored Dickies brand pants with a bandana displayed like a gang member, and being referred to as El Tejeda by his hyper-vigilant brown-skinned friends, and directing him away into a purely Spanish-speaking world that was characterized by a very low register. The hardness, however, would not keep him from greeting me with friendliness even then, as if brought back to the time he took a seat next to me in first grade as he asked me to pay him a visit at home. ¿Qué hubo, güero? ¿Cuándo le caes a mi cantón? By the time I reached 6th grade, he had been expelled from my elementary school after a fight in which he had severely injured Chris Lochner. College. Harry and I kept in touch, even throughout high school, albeit more and more dependent on his mother's encouragement for that, such as by his mother's showing up at home or telephoning and saying I was invited to the opera, to the country club, and the like. Yet as time had marched on through my 6th grade year in elementary school, my parents had sat me down at the kitchen table and had settled that there were activities in which I simply could not join Harry, telling me directly in Spanish, "You are not always going to be able to do the same things as Harry, Ivan. Obviously, if we could afford it, we would enroll you in tutoring with Harry, but our means are very limited right now. Your mom and I are each working 2 jobs and going to school, and we practically make only enough to pay the rent. Better jobs require English fluency." My mother recalls that this talk arose partly from Harry's mother's mentioning that Harry was getting multi-subject tutoring, that private schools were being looked into for the rest of Harry's education up to the 12th grade, and that she recommended tutoring in private school for me as well, because she had already taken me with Harry to visit these places, and had seen that I had enjoyed myself there. My mother had heard the costs, and had dismissed the possibility as to me, in shock. Yet she would consider in hindsight later, that my younger sister did receive college-bound academic tutoring all the way up to her admission to UC Berkeley, and that further consideration had then been warranted in my case. Harry's mom had spoken to my mother highly of Harry's college-bound academic prep center and Harry's private school several times afterwards, including throughout our high school years. But my parents' multi-employment, non-fluency in English, and hardship persisted prohibitively throughout, mitigating significantly only when my younger sister was in middle school. From my middle school years into the first 2 years of high school, my parentally unattended academic life had increasingly consisted of my going through the motions at school to return as soon as possible to playing soccer on predominantly Latino teams, practicing soccer with Latino kids on those teams, and associating predominantly with those Latino kids. As these kids had quit soccer and focused on partying in the latter part of high school, my parentally unattended academic life had then consisted, increasingly, of my going through the motions at school so that I could return to cars, to working on cars, and to working at Old Navy to make money with which to buy car parts, with which to in turn work on cars. My mother had expressed the hope that I would be a car mechanic, saying in Spanish, "You know, you're very good at repairing things. You'd make a good car mechanic. You should think about it because mechanics can make good money. You know, plumbers also make good money." She had then even helped me with with $1,000, with which I bought my first car 2 years into high school, saying she couldn't give me more, but that a future mechanic needed something to practice on. In time, my mother's news about Harry's activities started to sound as if she were reporting on a distant and older cousin from another country like France. Academic tutoring, piano lessons, rowing, international travel, piano concerts, fencing, French lessons, and so on. That divergence in our paths felt palpable when, for example, Harry and a bilingual French-English Franco-American kid who had attended our elementary school were animatedly comparing the recent stay of each in France with each's previous visit to Italy. Meanwhile, I sat nearby feeling like an interloper and forced an agreeable smile every time the other kid glanced at me, as if assuming I had a basis on which to pronounce myself on the indisputable superiority of the Venetian over the Parisian landscape. Notwithstanding the odds stacked against my developing a taste for natural science, college found me experiencing the satisfaction of grappling with natural phenomena as I sat in the library between classes, drawing energy orbitals of the neon atom, followed by those of a sodium atom, and then placing dots in the corresponding energy shells, musing to myself as I looked at the last unpaired electron of the sodium atom. Well, that explains why sodium metal is so reactive in water, while neon is a noble gas known for its stability, because sodium has that unstable atomic configuration with its lone electron out there, even though it seeks to acquire a filled outer shell with 2 electrons that would then lead it to hold that filled outer shell more closely to its atomic nucleus. Accordingly, I felt blindsided when I got a notification during the first few quarters of my college career that I was on academic probation, in spite of my efforts engaged in activity that felt to me was an effective form of studying. That warning was a painful wake-up call that threatened me with the possibility that those satisfactions would end, and also that I would be the first in my family to go to college in the US and the first to flunk out. Sensing a need to take drastic measures, the next morning I began to implement these by starting my routine of going for a run at 6 a.m., arriving at the library as soon as it opened at 8 a.m., set on spending my days there, moving forward, keeping my cell phone turned off the entire day, and ignoring emails from friends who eventually just stopped trying to communicate with me. While studying, I read and reread and then paraphrased, and I wrote pages on topics such as limits to infinity, feeling that I was gaining an understanding of limits by explaining to myself why the limit to infinity of the equation f of x equals 1 over x is 0. In this hope, I spent a half hour first writing down my thoughts on what that function could describe, proposing to myself that the equation could model the relationship between the remaining proportion of the original distance an athlete had to run and the passage of time in seconds, so that after 1 second, the runner had the original distance left to travel, after 2 seconds, half the distance, after 3 seconds, 1/3 left, after 4 seconds, 1/4 of the distance left, and so on. I felt gratified as I noted the interesting result that after, say, 3,600 seconds, i.e. an hour, or more, the runner would still not have completed the distance. Alas, I was struck by confusion and dread when my calculus professor nonetheless handed me back a low grade on an exam and told me that I needed to study more. That day I tendered my resignation at work and stopped working entirely, despite that I was offered a full-time position as a manager at Old Navy. I took out loans instead. In the extra free time that I now had, I found myself awaking one day with a sense that I was going to try something new and explore the academic resources center at school. That day saw me wander into a tutoring lab, restless to turn the page already and take a peek at the back of the book for the solutions. My tutors there presented me with practice problem-filled books in the subjects I was taking: chemistry, calculus, biology, physics, etc. Each tutoring session started with specific exercise problem sets. A sense of realization dawned on me as they advised me to use memorization and paraphrasing, not in isolation as I had done, but rather as my tutor explained. Why don't you try to focus on getting as much experience as possible, applying rules on concepts like limits to infinity, read the material once, and then try doing sets and sets of exercise problems. The focus on solving problems and getting feedback on your attempted solutions should familiarize you with aspects of the material that are most relevant. That material is the one you'll then want to commit to memory. To aid that memorization, you can use a number of tools: rephrasing the material in light of the author's exposition of it, as if seeking to engage in a dialogue with an informed author, flashcards, mnemonic aids, teaching the material to others, and so forth. All of that is supportive to the problem-solving based strategy required to learn your science coursework. I raised myself out of academic probation through tutoring and felt like I was in calmer waters by the time I convinced a friend who had started his own junk hauling business to buy me supplies and let me make biodiesel for his 5-truck fleet of trucks, arguing that using biodiesel would be good eco-friendly marketing for his business. Remaining vigilant but hopeful about my entering into a more successful relationship with college, I then found myself receptive to the idea of enrichment activities. When I was first exposed to that concept, a blue-eyed, blonde-haired, pale-skinned Anglo-American representative, Josh, from the exam prep company called Kaplan, had advised me in that regard after I had taken a medical school's admissions practice test. Look, I'm only telling you this because I've seen your practice exam scores, and you could have a good
good shot at doing well on the MCAT and then getting into medical school. But you can have the highest GPA, the highest MCAT score, and still your chances of getting into Stanford Med, Harvard Med, or UCSF and the like are prone to fail. Not trying to be a wet blanket, but you need enrichment activities to stand out. I was not as sure that I wanted to be a doctor as attracted by the sense of developing a coherent story for myself and the idea that becoming one would continue the profession that my parents had when they lived in Mexico. I was further attracted by the intellectual satisfaction that I had found in science, and by the fact that physicians were afforded respect by society. I was, however, sure that there was substance in the implied idea that students should have enrichment activities to make the most of their time in college, whether or not they applied to medical school. In addition to my receptivity to enrichment activities, an ethnic studies professor's lecture struck a note with me. That lecture had drawn up the idea before me of language as a key to resources in that language. It had presented the threat of exclusion from resources by its loss. To illustrate that, the professor had mentioned that a significant number of persons of Mexican descent in the U.S. lost the ability to speak Spanish, their native tongue. Finding that the lecture had an especially relevant connection to me, Jose Tejeda came to mind, along with his swear word, bestrewn Spanish. Following that thought was my reflection on my inability to respond to my parents fluently in Spanish. I had always answered my parents Spanish and English since roughly second grade in elementary school. Next, I found myself thinking of the Spanish that I spoke with friends, such as Jose Tejeda, during my early upbringing, simple as to vocabulary and syntax, and to put a number on it, representative of about 5% of my communication during that period. Also, the Spanish that Latino kids spoke in high school was often not Spanish, but rather was Spanglish, such as parquear. In terms of Spanish that would be understood universally, without doubt, among Spanish speakers, it constituted no more than 1% of total language use, and was composed of very simple Spanish phrases, such as telling someone impatiently to pass the ball harder. Tienes que darle el balón más fuerte. Somberly, I predicted that unless I undertook some measures, I would ultimately be significantly limited in my ability to communicate with my Spanish-speaking uncles, aunts, or cousins, or to understand what they understood, or to allow them to understand what I did. I sensed the challenge starting to take shape then, along the lines of, see if you can avoid that from happening to you. See if you can pick up where you left off your acquisition of your mother tongue. Taking up that challenge, the first great novel I read in Spanish was Don Quixote, because my ethnic studies professor, in passing, noted a resemblance between Don Quixote and the character named Masked Man, developed by the American comedian Lenny Bruce. I had felt curiosity to ascertain that link, and thinking of my Spanish challenge, felt that there could be worse places to start than a Spanish novel that had reached even American ears. But as I looked at the dedication, I felt clueless as to what was going on. Al Duque de Béjar, Marqués de Gibraleón, and yet pressed on, spurred on by the voice inside my head of a chemistry professor. Resist the urge to stop reading, and instead keep going, because often later reading will help you understand earlier text. Under the weight of my official coursework, I found myself nonetheless welcoming the challenge of reading Don Quixote any chance I got, almost every page of which I left covered by black ink and definitions of words in English that I looked up in a Spanish-English bilingual dictionary. One day I found my ears perking up at the presentation begun by the coordinator of the study abroad program at school in my biochemistry class. By then, I had already finished reading Don Quixote and had moved on to using only a Spanish dictionary to learn the meaning of words, and the online website of the Real Academia Española to learn verb conjugations. A deep sense of gratification mixed with relief had come at the end. As I was anxious to turn my focus to other materials in Spanish, I had discovered while reading Don Quixote, because I had gotten an annotated version of Don Quixote in which the commentators had added analyses, footnotes, and names of other erudite authors. Through readings derived from these references, in the database made available through DAONet by La Universidad de La Rioja, which I found by a Google search, I had then found other references to texts authored by, for example, members of the Real Academia Española de la Lengua, and articles in more tangentially related sources, such as the Spanish newspaper El País. A sense of discovery had spurred me on throughout these readings, as I found myself pitching into novels, including Miguel Delibes' unique and award-winning Diary of a Hunter, i.e. Diario de un Cazador, and La sombra del ciprés es alargada, i.e. The shadow of the cypress is long. I enjoyed, among other things, the nitty-gritty of the work of deciphering the regional language used by Delibes after the manner of hunters in the region of Castile, the region with which he identified. Thus, after I had gotten my copy of Diario de un Cazador, my suspicions were aroused that another meaning was present, for example in Delibes' use of burra chirriante, and I eventually researched in scholarly analyses in Spanish of Delibes' work and confirmed my suspicions with satisfaction that by burra chirriante, Delibes was referring to a bicycle, specifically a squeaky or creaky bicycle, that by repullar, Delibes was referring to the act of birds taking off upwards in flight when spooked, that by El Gran Duque, Delibes was referring to an owl, and so on. That sense of discovery was heightened as I also found a vast world of media, the National Radio of Spain, National Television of Spain, and the regional versions of these information outlets. Impressed by their quality, I
I listened to these resources daily on matters ranging from the history of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, such as La Noche Triste and the Armada Invencible, to the music of El Concierto de Aranjuez by Joaquín Rodrigo, to the physiology of a heart attack explained in Spanish by a cardiologist from the Clínica Universitaria de la Universidad de Navarra in Navarre, Spain. Accordingly, I was all ears when 3 students followed the presentation of the study abroad program director, adding their testimonials of the time they had studied in Munich, London, and Spain. And my focus was trained on the student who had studied in Spain, as she spoke with the manner of the initiate, talking to the non-initiates. After that, I found myself filled with a sense of resolution, and thinking of how to set myself up in the strongest position to study abroad in Spain, while giving due attention to my other academic interests. In that state, the idea of creating a capstone phase of my college career formed in my mind. Specifically under that vision, during the short period I had left in college before I left to Spain, I would max out my learning in the natural sciences, my self-development regarding Spanish, and enrichment activities. Sitting in the library in the tense state of wanting to have my cake and eat it too, and giving one final big push to my development in those 3 areas together, I found myself hatching the plan to volunteer as a Spanish interpreter at a hospital. My hope was that this opportunity would push to the max my science learning, my development in Spanish, and my goal of enrichment activities at school before I left to study abroad in Spain, because it would push me to integrate all 3. With a sense of butterflies mixed with hope, I found myself wondering whether a particular world-renowned hospital in the Bay Area, the hospital, might be open to something like a Spanish-English interpreter on a volunteer basis. In the next moment, however, I was hit by the expectation that speaking to anyone about that proposal at a place as demanding as the hospital would require me to have ready a statement of purpose. That expectation led me to imagine the gist of my statement as if in a stream of consciousness of images, my academic instruction on atomic and subatomic spin, alongside molecular magnetic resonance imaging machines at the hospital, my classwork on the Krebs cycle and other aspects of metabolism, and the consultations between nutritionists and patients at the hospital, my efforts to learn Spanish and Mexican patients at the hospital who could only speak Spanish, and so on. As I experienced an increased sense of conviction, I saw that statement taking on further definition when it segued into my imagining myself using Spanish with interpreters and talking fluently. This vision in turn transitioned into that of Spanish-speaking patients, nodding in understanding after hearing my interpretations of discussions on immune cells that, thanks to me, became intelligible to them. This vision was followed in turn by that of myself explaining in Spanish the workings of a CAT scanner, as distinct from that of an MRI scanner, with my textbook nearby. But I braced myself as I heard the devil's advocate in me push back with, "They're going to think, who does this kid think he is, acting as if he has something the hospital wants? He doesn't even have any affiliation with the hospital." Then they'll laugh and tell you to close the door on your way out. I leaned forward in my seat at that as I thought in response, even if they laugh at me, what if they don't? And even if they do, I don't think my trying to volunteer as a Spanish interpreter there is that outlandish. They probably wouldn't simply leave an unsupervised door open for just anyone to walk in and act with the same scope as a professional paid employee. They'll instead take precautions with volunteers, closely supervising them, limiting their scope of activity, or providing them with training. Because common sense alone tells you there is a difference between a professional paid employee and a volunteer that counsels taking measures like those. Further, I seek the mutual enrichment of volunteering my services to people who could be in need of them in terms of language and understanding of medical information that they're presented with. I've considered that my abilities in those respects could still have room for growth before they have blossomed fully, but there's evidence that I've been working on and have improved them significantly. Also, volunteering is sometimes considered to provide an intermediate position between learning and professionalism. That process left me with an anxious but hopeful sense of adventure, with which I then entered into an individual study room in the library, turned on my cell phone, called the hospital, and was ultimately informed that the hospital was accepting applications then to volunteer as a Spanish-English interpreter. Further, as the woman on the phone informed me, the director at the time of Interpretation and Translation Services, ITS, she could interview me on Monday at 8:30 a.m. because now it was 3:30 p.m. on Friday. She was scheduled to leave at 4 p.m. and I had told her that the 2 buses I needed to take to get there would get me there by 5:30 p.m. at the earliest. Besides having pointed out to me only half jokingly, to my embarrassment, that my shirt could use more ironing during my interview. The process of becoming a volunteer Spanish-English interpreter at the hospital felt as if it rolled smoothly on wheels, as I was encouraged to ask for permission to shadow, i.e. watch, take notes, and learn from the professional interpreters there as well as doctors. I was assigned and completed a medical terminology textbook. I completed the corresponding course on medical interpretation and ethics provided by the hospital's interpreters to all volunteers, and lastly I passed a timed oral and written exam. I fulfilled the mentioned requirements and showed up regularly at 8 a.m. on Mondays and Fridays, even during the summer for about 1.5 years. The mutual enrichment I experienced during my period as a volunteer at the hospital included that, as a reward to that, I got to be watched like a hawk by the interpreter I was assigned to while getting to, for example, tell a monolingual Spanish-speaking man that the form in front of him was to be filled out prior to his MRI scan, hear him ask impatiently why it mattered to his getting an MRI scan if he had been a metal grinder in Guatemala, or if he had gotten metal in his eye a long time ago, as if finding that his being asked to answer the questions on the form was tedious and pointless. Then find myself able to tell him myself that the strong magnet could cause movement of the metal, significant pain, and damage in the eye. Get to see the man's attitude change completely as he thereafter gave forthcoming answers to the questions on the form. Get to direct the technician's attention to the fact that the man's form indicated that he had been a metal grinder in Guatemala and had gotten a metal fragment stuck in his eye, lest the technician overlook it. And finally get to see the technician recommend a CT scan instead of the MRI scan, amidst the man's expressions of gratitude for avoiding him the pain of moving or burning metal in his eye. I also got to engage with the uneasiness of the challenge to improve my Spanish with interpreters, such as with Angela, who had studied journalism at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and whose recommendation that I study abroad in Spain seconded my decision to study in Spain, her native country. While I felt inhibited because my desire to speak fluently in Spanish was equaled and opposed by my perception that it took me more than twice as long to say something in Spanish than it would have taken me in English to say the same thing, together with a lot of stammering and rewording, Angela did a lot to put me at ease, because she once told me that reading, listening, and writing were not enough. As she put it in her amiably sententious manner, the only way I would get as fluent in Spanish as I was in English was to practice speaking, as I probably would not have achieved fluency in English based alone on reading, listening, and writing without speaking English. Her additional remark remained with me that some English speakers, as she had done herself, even took elocution lessons to improve their fluency and the effectiveness of their speech. Still, I struggled despite the patient demeanor she adopted. For example, when I sought to explain my takeaways on the Nobel Prize-winning novel La Familia de Pascual Duarte by Camilo José Cela, as if she were confident that the words would come. Her eyes were bright, shining, as if expecting me to deliver a joke. She settled into her chair as if getting comfy and urged me to tell her more. A ver, cuéntame, ¿de qué trata el libro? Taking longer than it would have taken for the words in English to arrive in my head, the words in Spanish finally came to me like a muddy river of irrelevant biographical facts mixed in with the most shocking aspects of the book. These unpleasant details were only instrumental, not the ends, of the purpose I originally had in mind in presenting them. Bueno, ya sabes que Camilo José Cela fue uno de los miembros de la Real Academia Española de la Lengua. Fue galardonado con el premio Nobel por su novela La Familia de Pascual Duarte. Se me hace que fue en 1989, aunque el libro fue publicado en la década de los 40. El protagonista, o sea Pascual Duarte, mata a su perra de casa a bocajarro, viola a la que será su mujer al principio del noviazgo, asesina al proxeneta de su hermana aplastándole la caja torácica con la rodilla, mata a pinchazos a la yegua que tiró a su mujer, tiene un hermanito con discapacidad intelectual que muere asfixiado al caer boca abajo en una tinaja de aceite de oliva, pero antes los cerdos le comen las orejas. As she looked at me with serene curiosity in her black shining eyes, she asked me my opinion of the book's content, and I sensed that I had lost sight of my original purpose. Embarrassed, I recalled that my purpose had not been merely to enumerate unpleasant and shocking details, but rather to offer a reason why the Nobel Prize could have been awarded for a book that had such unpleasant scenes, by drawing a comparison to one of Ernest Hemingway's texts. I initially wanted to share my opinion that Hemingway's reportorial description of the unpleasant details of the execution of cabinet ministers in our times was not unlike Camilo José Cela's in La Familia de Pascual Duarte regarding Pascual Duarte's biography, except that La Familia de Pascual Duarte was much longer and drew on other techniques that were valuable to effective exposition. That display of ability could partly explain why he got the Nobel Prize despite the unpleasantness of the subject matter, including the authorial device of presenting the story as a manuscript penned by the protagonist while in jail on death row and sent to the friend of one of the protagonist's victims, pursuant to whose testamentary instructions its finding was made possible in a drugstore, to the author, who in turn alleges he merely edited some particularly crude parts of that manuscript, but otherwise presents it as he found it. The contrast between the severe austerity of the book's setting and dark comedy, such as when the wife of Pascual Duarte jokes that the eels Pascual Duarte catches in the river behind their home are fat because they eat the same things a wealthy man who lives downtown does, only that they do so one day later. The contrast between rustic expressions such as Pascual Duarte's rustic civility in saying con perdón, i.e. pardon the expression, whenever Pascual Duarte uses the word pig, and poetic expression such as in a passage that describes the distance of a road into town as long and flat, like a day without bread, just to name a few examples. Frustrated that my purpose had gotten lost in my effort to think of the right words in Spanish, I saw her as she looked at me with that look of serene curiosity in her eyes, and then as she indicated that she was unfamiliar with the book's name, asked me my opinion of the book's content, and carefully qualified that a book could still be a good book, even though it had unpleasant content. ¿Cómo dices que se llama el libro? Familia de Pascual Duarte. ¿Pero qué te ha parecido el contenido del libro? A ver, no me malinterpretes. No digo que un libro no puede ser bueno solo porque tiene un contenido desagradable. Alas, these struggles were the tip of the iceberg on my road to mitigating the loss of my Spanish-speaking potential. My experience in Spain surprised me further as the extent of these challenges hit me like a bucket of cold water, intermingled with a sense of parallelism regarding my experiences with English. Upon my arrival in Pamplona, in the northern region of Spanish Navarre, I was first told that I could not remain enrolled in any Spanish as a second language class, beginning with Spanish language acquisition courses such as intensive Spanish for foreigners, nor the corresponding progression of more advanced Spanish language acquisition courses, because my use of my Mexican passport to travel to Spain indicated that I was Mexican and thus should not be in need of that class. My mind flew back then to the time when I was 5 years old and learning English as a second language in the mobile classrooms in Southern California, and I felt the idea burning inside me that if only I could access the resources to do so, I could absorb Spanish like a sponge, just like I had absorbed English like a sponge. Moreover, a stimulus to defy the odds reared up in front of me then. Doña Ana Mercedes Ibarreche Garcia, the director of the Spanish as a second language program, was a tall Spanish woman with white skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, about 45 years on her, and a broom-handled thin body, whom I then heard say with sneering incredulity to her colleague next to her at the fact that a Mexican student using a Mexican passport did not know how to speak Spanish. Vamos a ver. Luego me dirán que el japonés de Japón no sabe japonés, que el italiano de Italia no sabe italiano, que el inglés de Inglaterra no sabe inglés. ¿No te fastidia? With that matter settled, I adopted a pull-out all the stops response that brought with it a sense of acting in the shadows, as my family, including my father who has always acted as co-signer for the hefty loans to finance my education, acted in their communications as if I were seeing the sights and sounds of Spain. But I forbore from invitations to do so, and instead was most often to be found inside a classroom, doing the equivalent of highly compressed remedial coursework in Spanish with private tutors, alongside my coursework in the biosciences in Spanish. After I had returned to the US and had graduated from college and had been hired at the hospital, the vivid challenges of those times were recalled to my mind as a supervisor, a woman born, educated, and teacher by profession in Mexico City, confided to me that in a letter of recommendation she had written for me, she had touched on my difficulty on the one hand to speak Spanish fluently during my time volunteering at the hospital, and on the other hand, my radical transformation into a native level Spanish speaker throughout my time in Spain. After I thanked her and we parted, muted gratification, not elation, visited me as I revisited across time my elocution and language tutors, whom I had hired in Spain. Specifically, I was returned to the time when I submitted an oral and written analysis of parts chosen by my private Spanish tutors of Luis de Góngora's deliberately hyper-elaborate but beautifully rich and rewarding poem, La Fábula de Polífemo y Galatea. By that point, I had been faithfully hoping that my studious pains would pay off because I had pushed past upset in some unpleasant moments in my instruction. For example, in which my tutors had uninhibitedly dwelt on my Mexican pronunciation. One of them, to the others nodding in agreement, emphasized my failure to distinguish the S sound from the Z sound when followed by a vowel, as in Zamora, or when preceded by a vowel, as in Jerez. My language instructor of the two was white-skinned, tall, shiny shaved head, brown eyes, and rugged-featured. His body had been shaped into lean muscle by the road cycling he did daily to train for competitions. He had pointedly self-described as both Spanish and Basque, not only Basque. He had then volunteered the idea that in the US, everyone goes to learn Spanish in Mexico, since it is so close to the US, with the result that everyone sounds like a snake when speaking Spanish. Es que en América los yanquis se van a México para aprender el castellano, claro, como les queda tiro, y luego todos hablan el castellano como serpientes. Around that early period, I had also been first shown Góngora's La Fábula de Polífemo y Galatea. To my chagrin, my instructors had each seemed to overdose on delight at the perplexity I displayed, since at that stage, Góngora's combination of archaisms, departures from the expected placement of words, and myriad other rhetorical techniques left me with little else but flashes of a majestic movement of rhyme, the notion that the author had made the poem complicated on purpose, and a sense of challenge taking form inviting me to penetrate through that mystery-enshrouded, encoded message, written for the satisfaction of a select few who could decipher it. Yet at the end of my academic year in Spain, I had approached my task of explaining to my tutor that same poem I had committed to memory, submitted written analyses of in Spanish, had grown to love and hate, and whose techniques I had researched, alongside my elocution lessons and other coursework, reminding myself again of my purpose to avoid the loss of my Spanish-speaking potential, against his usual challenging disdain. I had launched into my explanation in Spanish, which I had already rehearsed at least 10 times. Las primeras 3 estrofas de la fábula de Polífemo y Galatea conforman la dedicatoria de Góngora a su mecenas, el Conde de Niebla. En la primera estrofa, Góngora dedica el poema a su mecenas, el Conde de Niebla, e invita al conde a escuchar los versos del poema. Estos, según Góngora,
fueron escritos por él como si los hubiera recibido de la musa Thalía. A continuación, Góngora prosigue a elogiar al conde, tanto de forma directa como de forma indirecta. Por ejemplo, elogia de forma directa al conde al calificarlo de excelso, es decir, al ensalzar al conde como el primero entre todos los demás condes. Sin embargo, el que podía denominarse de elogio indirecto es el que llama más la atención, tanto por su contenido como por el elevado grado de dificultad de los recursos retóricos que presenta. Es por tanto el elogio indirecto el que aporta más al significado que Góngora pretende transmitir en la primera estrofa y en el que ahora me centro. El primer elogio indirecto consiste en el conocimiento que Góngora muestra tener de la costumbre que tiene el conde de ir de casa temprano en la mañana. En concreto, en alusión a esa costumbre, Góngora emplea una metáfora en el octavo verso de la primera estrofa con la que equipara la acción de cazar con la de fatigar la selva, es decir, con la acción de dar caza a la presa hasta fatigar a esta. A esta metáfora Góngora añade la de si ya los muros no te ven, con la que equipara a los muros de la ciudad con una persona que está dotada de ojos con los que puede mirar al conde cuando éste se encuentra ocupado en las actividades de la casa. El segundo elogio indirecto nace del hermoso panorama en el que Góngora sitúa al conde. Aquí Góngora se detiene para pintar una situación meteorológica que distingue al conde de la misma manera que un hermoso palacio distingue al rey que habita en él. Así, aparece ante la vista del lector una transición de color violeta a color rojizo en el aspecto del cielo, que se corresponde con la que sucede cuando los colores oscuros del crepúsculo matutino se difuminan en los suaves matices rosáceos de la mañana. Al dibujar esa hermosa transición, Góngora además muestra gran esmero al emplear un lenguaje cromático que es latinado, exigente y extravagante, como por ejemplo al emplear los vocablos púrpuras y rosicler en el tercer verso. En las púrpuras horas, que es rosas la alba y rosicler el día. En el tercer elogio indirecto, Góngora relaciona al conde con el resplandor áureo del sol, a través de la metáfora que se encuentra en el quinto verso de la primera estrofa. Ahora que de luz tu niebla doras. Es decir, del mismo modo que el sol despide luz que da un hermoso color dorado a la niebla, asimismo, el conde también despide luz que da un hermoso color dorado a su condado de niebla. El cuarto elogio indirecto viene de otro aspecto que tiene la metáfora de antes, con la que se equipara la acción de cazar con la de fatigar la selva. Mediante esta metáfora, Góngora además presenta al conde como un cazador que está dotado de tanta habilidad para cazar, que no fatiga ya solo a una presa, sino que fatiga a cuanta presa contiene la selva, y por tanto, fatiga a toda la selva. Which in English could be translated as, the first three stanzas of the fable of Polifemo and Galatea make up Góngora's dedication to his patron, the Count of Niebla, i.e. the Count of Og. Specifically, in the first stanza, Góngora dedicates the poem to his patron, the Count of Niebla, and invites the Count to listen to the verses of the poem. These, according to Góngora, were written by him as if he had received them from the muse Thalía. Góngora then goes on to praise the Count, both directly and indirectly. For example, he directly praises the Count by calling him Excelsior, that is, extols the Count as the first among all other counts. However, what could be called indirect praise in the poem catches the attention more, both for its content and for the heightened difficulty level of its rhetorical devices. It is therefore the one that contributes most to the meaning that Góngora intends to convey in the first stanza, and on which I focus now. The first indirect praise consists of Góngora's knowledge of the Count's habit of going hunting early in the morning. Specifically, in allusion to this custom, Góngora uses a metaphor in the 8th verse of the first stanza with which he equates the action of hunting with that of fatiguing the forest, that is, to the action of hunting down prey until exhausting it. To this metaphor, Góngora adds, if the walls of Huelva are not yet seeing you, with which he equates the walls with a person who is endowed with eyes, with which that person can look at the Count when he is busy engaging in hunting activities. The second indirect praise stems from the beautiful panorama in which Góngora places the Count. Here Góngora stops to paint a meteorological setting that distinguishes the Count in the same way that a beautiful palace distinguishes the king who lives in it. Thus, appearing before the reader's eye is a transition from violet to reddish color in the appearance of the sky that corresponds to that in which the dark colors of morning twilight fade into the soft pink hues of morning. In drawing this beautiful transition, Góngora also shows great care in using a language of color that is Latinate, demanding, and extravagant, as for example in the use of the words purpureas and rosicler in the third line. In the purple hours, when the dawn is rose-colored and the day is rosicler. In the third indirect praise, Góngora relates the Count to the golden glow of the sun through the metaphor found in the first verse of the first stanza. Now that of light you gild your fog. That is, in the same way that the sun gives off light that gives a beautiful golden color to the fog, so too the Count gives off light that gives a beautiful golden color to his county of fog. The fourth indirect praise comes from another aspect of the metaphor from before, with which the action of hunting is equated with that of tiring the forest. Through this metaphor, Góngora also presents the Count as a hunter who is endowed with such such hunting skill that he not only fatigues one prey alone, but rather fatigues as much prey as the forest holds, and therefore leaves the entire forest exhausted. My language instructor had leaned forward a quarter of the way into my presentation in Spanish of the first stanza, had then rested his forearms flat on the table surface around his copy of the poem with a slight relaxed smile as I explained from the seat across the meaning of the first stanza in Spanish. As I finished explaining the first stanza, he nodded with a look of curiosity in his shining brown eyes that looked out of place in the frame set by his rugged features, and he said to move on to the fourth stanza. Bien, ahora pasemos a la cuarta estrofa.
Chapter 4, Road to Law School. I find that the hospital was where I experienced the full force of my vocation for the law. The experiences that I've described above combined with unforgettable lessons at the hospital. I, however, failed to find it very odd that this combination could have taken place there as it did, because it strikes me as unrealistic to expect that people's past experiences will politely wait outside of the doors of the workplace until the workday has ended. It strikes me as rather more realistic to expect that people would be hard-pressed to track all the ways in which their past experiences might be influencing them at work without special training or undermining their work performance. Why then should it be so very surprising that people can find within the workplace experiences that they have experienced outside of it? I fail to find it so surprising. In fact, some support for these notions can be found in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision in Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, involving a dispute that was analyzed under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and that arose from the custom that a high school football coach had of engaging in silent prayer during football games to give thanks for the performance of the players and the opportunity to be a significant part of their lives, which custom became the object of the school district's decision to refrain from rehiring the football coach because it did not want to be perceived as endorsing the coach's religious conduct. In relevant part, the test that the court stated in this case, in its ultimate determination for the football coach, reflects the idea that the workplace can find employees subject to ideas or influences that lie outside of the ambit of their official duties, i.e., to account for the complexity associated with the interplay between free speech rights and government employment. A two-step process applies. The first step involves a threshold inquiry into the nature of the speech at issue. If a public employee speaks pursuant to his or her official duties, this court has said the free speech clause generally will not shield the individual from an employer's control and discipline, because that kind of speech is, for constitutional purposes at least, the government's own speech. At the same time, and at the other end of the spectrum, when an employee speaks as a citizen addressing a matter of public concern, our cases indicate that the First Amendment may be implicated and courts should proceed to a second step. At this second step, our cases suggest that courts should attempt to engage in a delicate balancing of the competing interests surrounding the speech and its consequences. Among other things, courts at this second step have sometimes considered whether an employee's speech interests are outweighed by the interest of the state as an employer in promoting the efficiency of the public services it performs through its employees. Citation: Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, 142 Supreme Court, 2407, 2423, 2022. That is, the court's test for determining the extent to which the First Amendment to the United States Constitution offers protection to speech by a government employee impliedly recognizes that the workplace can find employees subject to ideas and influences that can exceed the sphere of their official duties, because they reflect a need to distinguish between those two comprehensive situations in order to potentially afford greater protection to the speech of the employee uttered at the workplace, but in the capacity of a citizen addressing a matter of public concern. Moreover, Kennedy indicates that, like the football coach who found occasions during his work that called on him to invoke his personal past regarding prayer, other people can find work experiences speaking to their personal past in one way or another. In light of the above, why should it seem so very odd that a worker in the workplace might be, as I find that I was, susceptible to motivators with origins external to the workplace, including feelings of solidarity with the weak and vulnerable, feelings of repugnance at unjustified inequalities of treatment, or other feelings born from that worker's life story? I fail to find it so odd. Further, why should it be so very odd that, as in my case at the hospital, the experiences that I've described above, combined with unforgettable lessons that were presented to me there, as if the latter spoke to the former. Those lessons arose from challenging work experiences at the hospital that moreover brought to life the disempowerment of linguistic exclusion and that of legal exclusion, in addition to presenting to me the link between these two types of disempowerment. During my work at the hospital, I also found solutions that resonated with my life story. After all, why should it be so very odd that solutions to problems found in the workplace can serve as solutions to problems that a worker has faced outside of the workplace? That this concept is not so very odd can be seen by considering the case of of Kent v. Howard, which indicates the idea that the law's realm of activity as a solution to problems does not necessarily become discontinuous at the workplace, thus indicating that the law can be an omnipresent solution to problems that a person could face in and out of the workplace. In Kent v. Howard, the United States District Court for the Southern District of California had before it allegations of sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace in violation of federal statutes and several state law tort claims, all of which have been brought by a facilities clerk at the Naval Air Station Miramar Navy Exchange in San Diego, California, against 3 civilian employees. Specifically, the court rejected the arguments by the defendants that the state law tort claims should be thrown out because the federal statute provided the exclusive remedy and trumped state law, noting that the plaintiff is free to pursue state law relief where the violation has gone beyond discrimination in the workplace and involved physical or emotional injury that is highly personal. Citation: Kent v. Howard, 801 F. Sup. 329, 332, Southern District, California, 1992. That is, it is not so very odd that solutions to problems of a highly personal nature that a worker could face in the workplace, such as state laws that offered the plaintiff in Kent relief for the physical and emotional injury arising from sexual harassment in the workplace, could be solutions to problems that a worker could have faced outside of the workplace. As Kent v. Howard illustrates, the law can present continuity in offering relief because state law continued to afford a basis for relief for the plaintiff against the physical and emotional intrusion she suffered due to sexual harassment in the workplace, just as it would have afforded her a basis for relief if that physical and emotional intrusion had occurred outside of the workplace. Only if the state law claims in that case had been limited to claims of discrimination in the workplace, then the federal laws would have provided the exclusive remedy for that discrimination. In my own case, my struggle to overcome several challenges that arose during my work experience at the hospital for the benefit of my patients, me, and the operations of the hospital led me similarly to find not simply the empowerment of the English language, but the empowerment of American law as a tool whose utility was not clearly limited to fixing only the problems that it was used to fix in the hospital. For example, using that empowerment for the benefit of my patients successfully, I then found myself prodded by my deep-rooted connection to the weak and vulnerable, along with my likewise entrenched aversion to unjustified inequality of treatment, as if American law could also help me address those problems. Initially, they both prodded me to research law schools, research that included graduation requirements and the entailments of practicing law. Moreover, I have found myself asking myself why it should seem so very odd to have the experience of vocation form as I did. However, I failed to find it so very odd. A source in which a definition of vocation has been given a legal effect that actually determined rights or liabilities was a case of Electronic Realty Associates, Inc. v. Lennon, in which, in relevant part, the plaintiff was a corporation engaging in real estate brokerage and was subject to liability under allegations that, among other things, it had engaged in selling insurance without a license to sell insurance by the fact that, as an incentive to using its member real estate brokers, it had offered a plan, Buyer's Protection Plan, to buyers of homes from its member real estate brokers, under which defects found in a home purchased in that transaction entitled the buyer to having those defects repaired by the plaintiff. Because a controlling issue on whether the plaintiff was selling insurance was whether its offering of the Buyer's Protection Plan was done as a vocation, the plaintiff responded to the allegations by seeking a judgment from the New York Supreme Court that declared that its vocation was not that of selling insurance. The New York Supreme Court gave effect in the plaintiff's favor to the following definition of vocation. One's vocation is the activity on which an individual or entity spends the major portion of time from which a living is made. Citation: Electronic Realty Associates, Inc. v. Lennon, 404 NYS 2D 283, 287, New York Supreme Court, 1978. That is, it was found that the plaintiff had only offered the Buyer Protection Plan as incidental to the major activity of the plaintiff in the real estate business, because it was used merely as an inducement for the sale and purchase of real estate. Thus, vocation has been defined with significant effects on the rights or liabilities of persons or entities as the activity from which one's living is made and in which one spends a major portion of time. Not unlike a determination that a buyer's protection plan is merely incidental to the work of providing real estate brokerage services, the challenges of work experience can give concrete grounds for making determinations that some activities have merely incidental status to the available activities that one can pursue as a major way to make one's living. Further, it strikes me that the decision to spend such a major portion of time engaged in an activity that one's very livelihood is to be derived from it could be, as I find having occurred in my case, attended by a feeling of accumulation, suitability, and inevitability, not lightly developed, but rather more akin to that of a growing mass of snow rolling down along the surface of a hill, added to by life story components more or less near the surface, added to by hearing one's name called out by a problem out there in the world, and corresponding evidence of suitability as a means to implementing a solution to it. In my own case, the more I engaged in research into law school and the practice of law, the more the components of my life story increased that initial prodding until it grew and grew to exhortation to command to mission. As the snowball picks up more and more snow, growing more and more as it rolls downhill towards inevitability.
Thus, joining that prodding was the voice of an ingrained drive described above to embody an autonomous source of protection, as if the law's protection had connected with that drive. Joining that prodding was the above described sense I had developed that language is a key to resources, as if I recognized that the corollary to that sense regarding the law was that there was a world of resources on the other side of the door that would remain shut without the key of the language of the law. Joining that prodding was the previously mentioned hard-learned lesson of the domino effect that can arise from limitations in access to resources of the English-speaking world, which limitations threaten further restrictions in access to resources, which further restrictions in access to resources limit future prospects, as if the prospect of learning the language of the law connected with the lessons I had learned in fighting to keep open doors that shortage of resources had threatened to keep shut. Joining that prodding was a voice recognizing with humility the tirelessness, intellect, and ambition that I had shown in overcoming obstacles to achieve my self-development and work-related goals as described earlier. Joining that prodding, a voice urged me as well of my above-mentioned need to be articulate as a matter of being secured in my rightful liberty against more than legitimate demands of others' subjective preferences, as if the prospect of learning the language of the law had connected with my consciousness that my rightful exercise of liberty might require the ability to articulate a defense of it. These voices all joined that prodding, which snowballed towards the inevitability of a sense of mission. In sum, I find that the hospital was where I experienced my vocation for the law with full force. Work life.
See if you can imagine, in light of the story so far, the following. You had been taking 2 buses, 22 miles in each direction, when you were then roughly 20 years of age, each Monday and Friday to volunteer as a Spanish-English medical interpreter at a world-renowned hospital with its correspondingly world-class Interpretation and Translation Services Department, ITS. During the last year and a half of your undergraduate education before you left to study abroad in Spain, you have shadowed, i.e. observed the work of, not only Spanish-English interpreters, but also interpreters of other languages and doctors. You, as I did, returned from Spain, filed your petition for graduation, and decided to return to visit the hospital. The head of ITS poked his head out of his office because he'd heard the commotion of several interpreters' laughing voices. Ivan's back, lo han españolizado. He, Mr. Carlos Ortega, emerged from his office, walked towards you with his usual business-like manner, and your soon-to-be colleagues dispersed deferentially, sensing that he wanted to have a private discussion with you. I felt the proper thing to do was to square up, and did so, greeting him in Spanish, only refraining from the Mexican Spanish usage of don, because I once heard him tell someone he much preferred instead to be treated according to the tuteo form of address. Buenos días, Carlos, ¿cómo estás? He greeted me back, and as if remarking matter-of-factly on a surprising and humorous development, noted that I had returned from Spain. Hola, Ivan, ¿qué tal? Veo que ya regresaste de España. He proceeded to disclose a shrewd interviewing practice that he had just engaged in, as he confided to me that he had delayed coming out to say hello upon hearing my voice in the office. With my cautious but hopeful sense that he was foreshadowing a job offer, I heard him admit that he had restrained himself so that he could evaluate my Spanish from his office. He podido escucharte desde mi despacho ahora cuando hablabas con Ángela y los demás intérpretes. Dejé que pasara un rato antes de salir a saludarte para que pudiera comprobar la mejoría en tu español. Y debo decirte que se nota que le has sacado provecho a tu estancia en la madre patria. Next, my sense that he was up to something gave way to my pleasant surprise as he went straight to the point and offered me a job, telling me unnecessarily that I could think about it and talk it over later with him. Bueno, mira, do you want to work? Si quieres piénsatelo y luego hablamos más. I had often considered applying in the past as I envisioned prolonging the satisfaction of my enrichment experiences and getting paid for it. He added that he was headed to a meeting with the head of the emergency department. Ahora me marcho, que tengo una reunión con el jefe de urgencias. My pleasant feeling of surprise gave way to the sense of a need to seize the opportunity, recalling that I had seen many applicants during my time there, and thus I did not think twice and accepted his offer. Por supuesto, Carlos, I accept. He said, Bueno, me alegro de oírlo. Welcome aboard. I say this because I know that you will pass the interpretation and translation exam. You've completed the medical terminology course a long time ago during your volunteer period. Your English and Spanish are great, your colleagues speak very highly of you, and you've done the most hours we've ever had a volunteer do of shadowing and supervised interpretation. In the first few months of my employment, all I knew about Donald was that he looked and talked like an Anglo-American, that he was one of the nurses in the emergency department, and that 90% of the times that he had seen me enter the emergency department, ED, he had let out a loud exclamation with a heavily anglicized accent, along the lines of, Senor, I'll interprete. He had also hung on my shoulder when he had found me in the corridor of the ED, engaged in an interpretation, pulling my shoulder and saying, Come on, let's go. This way. We need you this way. This response to my presence struck me as remarkable, to say the least, because when I had shadowed other interpreters, such as Washington-born Anglo-American Spanish interpreter named Michael, and Donald was in the emergency department, Michael's presence would elicit nothing more than a down-to-business approach, such as, Hello, Michael. Are you here because our secretary told you we need an interpreter? Great. Can I tell you a bit of the diagnosis and treatment plan before we go and talk to the patient? Because this medication needs to be taken in a bit of an unusual manner, and I want to make sure we're on the same page in there, okay? I was thus sure that Donald could conduct himself professionally in his job, and struggled to explain to myself why that ability went out the window on the occasion of my unaccompanied presence in the ED. On top of this feeling of puzzlement, I found the devil's advocate part of me telling me, well, aren't you just being a susceptible Mexican? Quick to find offense to your honor and all that. Yet, with disappointment, the counterpoint to that question which came to mind was my experience with another nurse, Holly. Blue eyes, blonde hair, orange hue tan, as if from a can, Anglo-American. Just the other day, she had again seen me as the interpreter on duty and had proceeded to send a request for interpretation services in the ED. That request had caused me to leave a patient unaided, yet again, because of the ED's priority over any other hospital unit. To my disappointment, I had found Holly and was told by her, similarly to at least 4 prior occasions. Hola, señor. ¿Cómo está? ¿Está teniendo uno bueno día? Haha. When are you going to teach me Spanish so I can order food when I go to Mexico? But this time, I had not played along, which had elicited her reply. No, there's no patient needing an interpreter right now. I'm needing an interpreter to practice my Espanol. Haha. Well, I didn't know you were with another patient, okay? With disappointment, another recent experience that similarly came to mind was the diversion of time and work from other patients and assignments that was required to perform a simple interpretation for Dr. Smith. White, brown-haired, brown-eyed, tall, thin, Anglo-American. For example, she suddenly interrupted my accurate interpretation of whooping cough mid-sentence, i.e., los estudios diagnósticos y la evaluación médica muestran que su hijo tiene una tosferina. With her eyes narrowed tensely on me, since the qualifier ferina apparently had gotten lost in translation to her, she exclaimed, "No, I didn't say that. I did not only say a cough, I said whooping cough." In case you didn't know, there's a significant difference between an ordinary cough and a whooping cough. With disappointment, another memory that came to mind was a similar diversion of time and work from other patients and assignments that was required to perform a simple interpretation for another nurse, Karen. Karen had yet again displayed her usual extra scrutiny and high false positive rate with me. When, for example, she had shouted, wait, no, not what I said, as she interrupted my accurate interpretation of has a viral upper respiratory tract infection, you know, a cold, tiene un constipado, que también se conoce como una infección viral de las vías respiratorias superiores. Then she had glared at me and demanded, when did I say constipated? An upper respiratory infection is not constipation, it's basically a common cold. I thought of the elderly Spanish-speaking patient I had left unaccompanied in the imaging department to interpret for Karen, and forced a smile, along with a restrained reply that constipado does not mean constipation, it means a common cold. Her head recoiled in surprise, and she said, oh, it does? I did not know that. Why would it sound so much like constipation and mean something entirely different? That's crazy Spanish for you. Compounding my sense of disappointment was the fact that no other Anglo-American Spanish interpreter had any similar experiences to report, whereas my native Spanish-speaking colleagues told me that they knew exactly what I was talking about, and to just resign myself to it because the Anglo-American staff were not going to change. I was going to be perceived as a hypersensitive Mexican, and if I tried to take these problems to higher-ups in the hospital, I was going to find myself with face after face of white Anglo-Americans telling me to get on with my work or leave. Donald once told me with an initial friendly tone, so I hear you like books, catching me unprepared as he suddenly snatched the book I had in my hands, which was Evelyn Waugh's sensual, religious masterpiece, Brideshead Revisited. I found it brusque, to say the least, to suddenly be subjected to his snatching my book from my hands, a feeling not lightened by Donald's following up with, so what does this authoress go on about? But I swallowed under the advice of my co-workers and my attempt to rationalize it, as I told myself in those early days that appeasement was the better strategy for the Spanish interpreter working in an Anglo-American dominated environment in which he had just arrived. I even analogized that, all things considered, perhaps if Donald had a parallel story to mine, except as an Anglo-American English-Spanish interpreter with English-speaking origin, working at a hospital in Madrid, he'd be swimming against the current too. If in his first days he tried to address every instance in which Jose, the Spanish nurse, addressed him clamorously as Mr. the interpreter, and failed to give him helpful background information before beginning an interpretation, or every instance of Jose's invasively hanging onto his shoulder and pulling him, or every instance of Jose's grabbing his copy of, say, Jorge Luis Borges's El Libro de los Seres Imaginarios from his hands under the staccato sounds of Jose's Spaniard voice. Oye, Donald, me cuentan que eres aficionado a la lectura. ¿Y ese libro que traes ahí? Trae para acá, Donald. A ver, El Libro de los Seres Imaginarios de Jorge Luis Borges. ¿Y qué tanto dice ese tal Borges? Under that early sense of appeasement, I thought perhaps that poor Donald would have forced a smile, would have swallowed his urge to tell Jose to be professional, and would have simply said, Creo que te resultaría menos libro, Jose. Te lo presto si quieres. I too just forced a smile and said, You'd like it, Donald. You can borrow it if you want. With an experimentally minded inclination to find solutions within my control and a desire to kill two birds with one stone, I approached the idea of taking elocution lessons in English. I considered that I would not have many chances to take elocution lessons, and since Americans respected the English of the English, and the English respected their own received pronunciation, but for better or worse, it was not the case that all of that was true the other way around. I chose to take elocution lessons in received pronunciation. A highly recommended elocution teacher by my interpreter colleagues, Andrew Williams, black-skinned, brown, laughing eyes, bald head, round face, broad smile, with a friendly and restless manner, born and raised in Bristol, England, and a graduate of the prestigious Old Vic Theatre School, thus became my elocution teacher for the next year. I felt a sense of deja vu regarding my professors in Spain in my first meeting over Skype with Andrew, except that he made their propensity to volunteer evidence of linguistic chauvinism pale in comparison as he rushed forth in a flurry of unsolicited remarks about my American English, that I spoke like the Americans he'd seen on a sitcom, that American pronunciation such as mine was distinctive for being rhotic, which gave most Americans utterances a farmer or pirate-like quality, that he hated Halloween, an American invention, that he thought it absurd how the early Americans like Noah Webster had rejected good old British spelling, such as of words like color with a U in favor of color without a U, and that learning received pronunciation was a brilliant idea because rhotic pronunciation is not generally seen as standard pronunciation or of especially high value in comparison to standard pronunciation, which is the pronunciation that developed in England, the source of English. I felt curious as to what non-disclosure of my Spanish-speaking origins would lead to, and kept mum about them, with a sense of keeping my eyes on the prize. I pressed on with my lessons, and one day he managed to catch my attention more seriously, when he asserted with his crisp received pronunciation and booming theater voice the experiences of racism that he had suffered in the US, and had defeated because of his command of the English language. Because, for example, let me tell you about one time that I was shopping in a mall in New York. I realized I was being followed by a white American security guard. I don't know how tall you are, but he was tall. I remember that. A tall and lanky chap. I thought he was a policeman, and then thought to myself, oh no, because, well, you see stories on the news about black Americans getting smashed up by the police, but I never expected to be in a similar situation in all my life. So I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and he didn't say anything, but just stared back and continued to follow me. It was quite intimidating, if I'm honest. Finally, I turned around, and very politely, so as to not provoke him, I said very politely, in the same tone that I'm using now, "Excuse me, officer, am I being followed for any particular reason?" And you know what he did? He jumped back when he heard the manner of my speech. Obviously, well, I can't be 100% sure, but I reckon he was taken aback because he was expecting me to talk like a black American. He wasn't expecting me to sound English from England. Now I can laugh at it all because I can look at that situation from his vantage, but at that moment I was scared. He probably thought he was following, a black American, probably assuming I had shoplifted, but suddenly he found himself hearing a bloke he thinks is a black American talking to him in RP, which to him must sound like Downtown Abbey, the Queen. And I know what you're going to say because most white people, they'll get defensive when they hear stories like these. Well, I'm sure it was just an innocent mistake anyone could have made, nothing to do with racism and so on, but I'm quite sure I wasn't thinking that for no reason. Why would he just stare back and keep following me as if purposefully trying to make me feel fear? He immediately apologized and said that it had been a case of mistaken identity, and he walked away quickly like he was nervous. If it hadn't been for my ability to speak RP, who knows how that incident would have ended. Genesis of the law school dream. In the course of writing my law school admissions essay, I engaged the services of a Mexican-American woman who introduced herself as a tutor, lawyer, and Harvard Law School HLS graduate, who inspired confidence in me as she encouraged me to write about real experiences that had challenged me as they pertained to my vocation for the law, because she considered that vocation grew out of a problem out in the world, the solution to which was aligned with one's life. One of her questions was, as to the problem out there in the world of asserting one's rights, to which the law is a solution, how did your life align with that solution? Please don't tell me. Instead, show me. My advice is to be mindful of the fact that the social, racial, or economic background of your audience, that is the law school admissions committee, will likely be different from your own. With a sense that I neither had ampleness nor restriction of time with which to begin an answer, I began explaining that one night at the hospital, there was a conference room with about 30 people, one of them a doctor, the rest family, 9 p.m. in California. It was a room full of worn-out clothes, shabby hats, well-cared-for sombrero, and weary brown faces, punctuated by dark pairs of eyes. The doctor had then repeated with tired eyes that the standardized treatment protocol for drowning victims had been implemented, and I dutifully interpreted his words, with a sense that their meaning was not primarily at the literal level, but rather at the functional level, because the doctor's purpose in using them at that particular time was to address legal liability issues. Se ha realizado protocolo común para la actuación sanitaria ante un ahogamiento. The entire room recoiled, silently, at the reference to drowning, i.e. ahogamiento. Debris and fluid from the lake had reached every part of the lungs in the drowning. The supervising doctor had done exactly what he was supposed to do, including sucking out liquid with special instruments, using drugs to expel the water, and testing the patient's lungs to see if they could function at all on their own. Swelling in the brain had gotten to the point that a piece of the skull had to be cut off. But as I looked around the room, the grieving and stunned faces still appeared blank, even though competent English speakers would have recognized as a matter of second nature the implication that the doctor was, to put it bluntly, couching his report to the family in terms of mitigating exposure to liability by declaring that there had been no departure from the standard procedure, despite the bad news he was going to deliver to them. But I found myself then seeing exclusion from the ambit of information because of the inability to speak English, positioned side by side with exclusion from the ambit of legal rights. My sense of connection to the weak established from my earliest years kicked in, joined by my similarly entrenched aversion to unjustified inequalities, as the doctor's lucid Anglo-American eyes looked at me, framed by an imploring expression that seemed to say, make sure they understand that their son died despite having received perfect care. I had often silently empathized and sympathized with the frustration the doctors manifested when they communicated with Spanish-speaking patients or patients' families. I had not been unmoved by sympathy even when I had heard the attending physician in the emergency department, once blurted out to a colleague, "You know, Mike, I just don't know what else to do. You try and talk to these people, and you even do it with an interpreter who's a native speaker of their language, and there's still those, third world inefficiencies that get in the way." I myself had experienced some of those third world inefficiencies, as I had often found myself needing to spend too much time prompting my patients on matters that were so basic that they should have required no prompting, such as when I prompted a Mexican miscarriage patient over whom the diagnosis she got appeared to wash over, like a warm breeze, asking her whether she had any questions she wanted me to ask the doctor for her, such as questions regarding the relative risks and benefits of the proposed treatment options, the causes of the miscarriage, her prognosis, and so forth. But that inclination to empathy and sympathy was subject to my experiences, including my year of studying abroad, which had shown me that a combination of skepticism and undereducation was not unique to Mexican patients or patients of Spanish-speaking origins, because midway through that experience, I had seen fair-skinned, black, brown, or blue-eyed, dark or light-haired Anglo-Americans interact similarly awkwardly over basic administrative procedures related to enrolling in classes, experiences in which compassion moved me to go and translate into English for them, as we were watched by similarly frustrated Spaniards in Spain. In this case, the child had been flown into the hospital by helicopter from the lake in which he drowned. 29 pairs of dark eyes focused expectantly on me. I took a deep breath and said gently in Spanish, realizing that it was unrealistic for the doctor to be blunt about the liability issue, but hopeful about finding a middle ground that would have existed in the case of an Anglo-American family. "If you would like the doctor to explain what he means by the term standard protocol, that would be understandable." I tried to resist the urge to glance at the doctor while adding preemptively, "That's why the hospital provides an interpreter, in accordance with federal regulations, to ensure your understanding." After everyone had said, "Sí, por favor," with a shy nod, the doctor, not unfamiliar with Spanish, began to nod earnestly and express thanks, even before I had finished, at the fact that I had expressed his willingness to clarify matters. Then he made good use of the ensuing opportunity to frame his answer carefully, and he told them that what he had meant by referring to a standard protocol of care for victims of drowning was to reassure them that he had taken every action supported by science to save Alonso's life, and that by applying the standard protocol, basically, your 16-year-old son got the same treatment that my own 15-year-old son would have received. But sadly, the damage in Alonso's case is irreversible and fatal, despite that treatment. There was at this point a choke in the boy's father's throat, as he broke his patriarchal stoicism and expressed gratitude to the doctor peaceably, along with his belief that the outcome now remained in God's hands. "Gracias, doctor. Sé que ahora está todo en manos de Dios." But there had been a time before that conference in which, without any expectation of a transformative event to come, I had found myself accompanying an elderly Mexican patient one day, who was quiet-spoken and about 66 years of age, as the interpreter assigned to him. An Anglo-American doctor with blonde hair, pale skin, blue eyes, a stocky frame, white lab coat, and booming voice entered and thundered every one of her statements an over-the-top exclamation. "Okay, interpreter, I want you behind the curtain. This is Mr. Gonzalez. I'm Dr. Schwartz. He already knows me. I already know him. And today he has to undergo a rectal exam. So get behind the curtain, tell him to stand by the exam table and to lower his pants. I don't need a lot of talking. This should be simple and quick." As she said these words, she seemed to do everything at once, like the Tasmanian devil cartoon character, requiring me to perform the corresponding interpretation simultaneously. She walked over to me, nudged my chest backwards with all of her right hand's fingertips towards the exam room door, towards which I backed appeasingly. She grasped Mr. Gonzalez by the arm with her left hand, pulled him towards her, and drew the curtain in front of me as I finished interpreting her words simultaneously. Mr. Gonzalez could be heard issuing a short, uncomfortable laugh, and then a heavily Spanish-accented, confused, and pleading, "Doctor, okay, please, uno moment." I felt helplessly ignorant as to the language and the rights that could have made me an effective advocate for Mr. Gonzalez, and yet felt he deserved someone, perhaps someone who could give effect to the requirement that Mr. Gonzalez only would undergo the rectal exam on a reasonably informed basis as to relevant alternatives, and only would do so on a voluntary basis. On top of this impotence, I felt the apprehension that I, as a male, needed to avoid any possibility that the doctor could claim, even if illegitimately, that she had felt that I was a threat to her safety at any point, because I could foresee the possibility of her creating a smokescreen regarding her wrongdoing. Impotence and pain were what I felt as Mr. Gonzalez said in his wavering voice, "Excuse me, doctora, please, I say the interpreter one thing, okay?" Dr. Schwartz yelled, and I interpreted immediately. "No, interpreter, repeat what I said to him." Mr. Gonzalez hurriedly gave the reasons why he was opposed to the rectal exam, and I interpreted them hopefully and simultaneously into English. "Oiga, por favor, señor intérprete, dígale a la doctora que no quiero que me hagan ese examen. La vez pasada que me lo hicieron, me ocasionaron mucho dolor." The doctor said, and I interpreted simultaneously with bitterness in the back of my throat, "Just tell him to lower his pants and get on the exam table, on his side, so I can examine him. I'm not going to talk with either of you further, and will just call security if either of you continues to be uncooperative." After that, there was silence. I stood behind the curtain and struggled to make out their forms through the curtain. I heard the clinking of Mr. Gonzalez's belt buckle as his belt was unfastened. I heard Mr. Gonzalez plaintively say to the doctor some last words in English, "Doctor, too much pain last time. Please, no exam." Next, with the sense of seeing the cow go to the slaughterhouse, I thought I saw a form climb a step and settle on the exam table in a fetal-like position. Next, I heard a latex glove snap. Next, I heard a terrible terrible howl. Then I felt unhelpful and angry as I heard Mr. Gonzalez's crying, repeating as if to himself through sobs. He had said he did not want the exam because it would hurt too much. Le dije que no quería que me hiciera el examen porque sabía que me iba a doler demasiado. I was flooded by a sarcastic sense that in the doctor's retort to Mr. Gonzalez, she used the same indifference she'd have used if her own mother or father had been in his place. No doubt. Oh, come on, you'll be fine. I did it as fast as I could. Stopped by reception to get a summary of your visit. That session stung me with the infliction of one of the deepest scars that I acquired throughout my career at the hospital. The hurt was deepened by my knowledge that from my days of shadowing doctors and nurses, Anglo-American patients loved the hospital's doctors, and the hospital's doctors shone when they were dealing with their Anglo-American English-speaking patients. I felt a glow inside as these patients visibly showed satisfaction, as they could convey their preferences in English to a doctor who would then try to shape treatment accordingly. Still pained by that ordeal, I had sometime later found myself with my ears perked up at a staff meeting. The problem was addressed at that time that a significant number of patients who only spoke Spanish were being seen without an interpreter because healthcare providers refused to use interpreters. My interest was further piqued when I heard new words used, such as risk management and compliance department, which were summed up in the meeting as basically the hospital's lawyers, with a nascent sense of the hierarchy between the law and everyone else, including doctors. I listened to the management authorized strategy with which to make sure that patients who preferred an interpreter could have access to one. So next time a doctor tells you they don't need an interpreter, tell the doctor that it's the law. He or she may have an MD, but the law is the law and trumps his or her MD. Under the Affordable Care Act, the patient has to be offered an interpreter, or the hospital could be found to be in violation of the law because it receives federal funds from Medicare, from the Department of Health and Human Services. Tell them to talk to risk management if they have a problem with it. Still reeling from my experience with Mr. Gonzalez, and finding myself wondering if a law existed that would have trumped Dr. Schwartz's authority then. I pored over the Affordable Care Act, and partly by sheer luck and insistence, ended up finding the implemented regulations, which I preferred because they were more specific, not knowing then anything about administrative law or that they were central to asserting the rights that were set forth in the statute. My reaction at that time upon seeing the law and the regulations was tantamount to a state of being confronted by complexity I never knew existed, as I marveled at the sheer size of the Code of Federal Regulations. At last, I cautiously surmised that Section 92.3 of Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations made the relevant regulations applicable to the hospital, which I had been told received Medicare funds, because I saw that Subdivision A read, A, except as otherwise provided in this part applies to 1. Any health program or activity, any part of which is receiving federal financial assistance, including credits, subsidies, or contracts of insurance, provided by the department. Then I cautiously inspected the key requirement of meaningful access by reasonable steps under Section 92.101 of the Code of Federal Regulations, i.e. A. Any entity operating or administering a health program or activity subject to this part shall take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access to such programs or activities by limited English proficient individuals. Next, I purposefully memorized the substance of these provisions as they apply to the hospital, i.e. that under Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 1. A health program or activity, 2. Receiving federal financial assistance, 3. Had to take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access thereto by LEP individuals. I then experienced the empowerment of the law in responding to Dr. Matheson. This was the same Dr. Matheson who again said, Shoo, we don't need you. I speak Spanish, so we'll be fine. I delivered the regulations without batting an eye, with a request at the end to permit the patient to decide whether she wanted an interpreter. Despite Dr. Matheson's hovering presence as I offered my interpretation services to the patient meekly said she wanted an interpreter if it was okay with the doctor. Pues sí, si la doctora no tiene inconveniente, creo que me ayudaría bastante. Puedo entender cosas sencillas, pero con frecuencia se me escapan algunas palabras. Algunos términos médicos no los alcanzo a comprender. The fact that the mentioned regulations specified that meaningful access was required of covered institutions also made me feel supported in, for example, initiating questions a patient or patient's family in like circumstances could reasonably have as to what was being referred to when doctor's language required unpacking, as in the above-mentioned case by the term standard protocol. Under that sense of support from the federal law, I found myself developing the habit of glancing at the doctor while preemptively adding, that's why the hospital provides an interpreter, in accordance with federal regulations, to ensure your understanding. The news sometime later that statistics showed increased interpreter usage by doctors, that risk management and the compliance departments were happy about that because it lowered the hospital's risk of liability in case of a mishap attributable to intercultural miscommunication, and the corresponding empowerment I experienced using American law for the benefit of my patients' equality of treatment filled me with a sense of refinement of ideas. While English was powerful, American law was that power to the umpteenth power, with a sense that similarly successful experiences to those described above were a mere dabble in the law, and struck by the curiosity to know more about the law, legal education, and the practice of law, I was led to the website of Santa Clara University School of Law. I had considered that if I did go to law school, I should remain in the Silicon Valley, which narrowed down my options to Stanford or Santa Clara Law. However, I had gotten a new assignment at the San Jose location location of the hospital's outpatient center, close to Santa Clara University, and wanted to stay close to my work in case I would continue working during law school. Further, I had gotten sober and satisfied testimonials from an SUU law alumnus. On top of that, I had heard from 3 of my colleagues who were alumni of the School of Business at Santa Clara University, who described an educational environment that was still progressing towards improving inclusiveness of backgrounds, but was relatively friendly to people with a Spanish-speaking background. By then, I had also seen the statistics and had a basis for the sense that the legal field was already conservative. It would be hard climbing for a Mexican American. Moreover, on that website, I found a summary of competencies required to graduate, which struck me as though someone privy to the contents of my mind was writing it as quickly as I was reading. 1. Lawyers must know the law, and law school is the first and in many respects the most important opportunity for them to learn the law. 2. Effectively communicating through writing is the lawyer's most fundamental and perhaps most utilized skill. Only through repeated attempts at synthesizing cases, presenting analogical arguments, drafting contractual provisions, etc., will students be able to close the gap between thought and written word. Repeated practice in drafting and in constructive critique should help the law student develop strength in the following areas: organization and logical flow, so that a reader easily follows the relationship between sub-arguments and major themes; efficiency in structure and verbiage, so that ideas are expressed as concisely as possible; command of citation requirements, formatting, spelling, and grammar, so that the writer is able to convey their authority over the material and their attention to detail; persuasive narrative structure, ability to serve as a constructive critic for colleagues or supervisees seeking to improve their own writing. 3. Legal analysis is one of the core competencies needed by lawyers and taught in law school. The competency includes 3 essential abilities: issue identification, analysis of the issues, and formulation of legal arguments that address and resolve the issues. 4. Good interpersonal skills are central to the functioning of a competent lawyer, and it is important that students work to improve their competency in this essential set of skills. Strong self-awareness, the ability to work well with others, and excellent communication skills are all components of this essential competency. 5. It is essential for students and lawyers to develop the competencies to take initiative. 6. Creative problem solving is essential to effective lawyering. Lawyers must be forward-thinking, flexible, able to apply and interpret law, proactive and reactive. 7. Leadership abilities can be taught and can be learned and developed. And since 2009, Santa Clara Law has offered leadership development courses for its students and offered leadership education programs and activities for lawyers, judges, and law students. That is, I found myself eager at the thought that SUU Law would push a student such as me to become a dynamic initiator capable of applying detail-oriented, creative intellectual energy, the empowering language of American law, and persuasion in writing and in speech in the service of asserting people's rights. In the early days that I researched law school, including going to meet with a Mexican-American lawyer at SUU Law who engaged me warmly in outreach from the first of our several meetings over the phone and in person, my initial sense of cautious curiosity was prodded on by the immediate experiences with the empowerment of the law as a means to benefit my patients. However, as I stood before the giant task of my full-time work schedule and preparation for the law school admissions test, LSAT, with the LSAT prep company blueprint, I found myself double-checking. Then, I envisioned myself asserting the rights of Hispanics, Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, and people of all backgrounds, because it struck me that my experiences had taught me that it would be mediocrity of ambition and compassion to seek to only be part of the solution for one narrow group of persons. Exclusion from the ability to assert rights would be a problem no matter who the excluded were. Moreover, I found myself taking from my experiences the lessons that where there is social exclusion based on language, legal exclusion is not far off. I also thought of the linguistic chauvinism that I had seen and saw that exclusion on the basis of language could affect English speakers, even in relation to the English-speaking world. Non-Spanish-speaking Americans, Anglo-Americans, and other English-speaking Americans, too, could be subject to exclusion on the basis of language relative to the resources of the Spanish-speaking world. I found myself increasingly experiencing a sense of momentum as I also considered what I could further do with the law as my sword, such as gain the ability to protect myself and others from illegitimate threats. I found myself considering as well, in light of the powerful words attainable by engaging in American legal education, the lesson that language is a key to resources, without which key resulting privations in resources, like a row of dominoes, lead to further privations and restricted future prospects. I had exhibit A of that in the close call I had in overcoming challenges in college, secondary to a lack of educational resources, traceable in turn to the linguistic deficiencies of my parents. As if in response to my inner devil's advocate regarding my sufficiency to take on the challenge of studying the law, I also found myself hearing a voice humbled by experience, recognizing with that humility the tirelessness, intellect, and ambition that I had shown in overcoming obstacles to achieve my self-development and work-related goals, despite stacked odds. After I scored well on the LSAT, my momentum had continued towards inevitability as I submitted my law school application. With gratitude, I received a significant academic merit merit scholarship at SEU Law, took out more loans as to the remainder of my tuition, and took my first seat in a law school classroom on day 1 of torts class. Chapter 5, Law School. I have found that my law school journey left me with the satisfaction of overcoming a few challenges that might be expected to present themselves to someone from my background when he strives to break ground and enter into the legal field in the light of the foregoing chapters of my life. After all, why should it be so surprising, in light of the above story, that a Mexican-American first-generation law student could find the early days of law school challenging when he found himself before a casebook that was treated as if it had been developed for use by students and professors as a center of the universe for the formal study of the law? I find it rather unsurprising. Was the casebook not to be taken to every class? Yes, it was. Were readings of the casebook not the chief assignments during the semester? Yes, they were. Did discussion in class not take place with the casebook open in front of one? Yes, it did. Is it not the case that to learn a subject, the learner must know where to find all the information required to learn that subject? Yes. Do college professors omit an affirmative presentation of the sources of information that the student will need to learn the required subject matter? No, they generally assign a textbook and affirmatively present other sources that contain the information the student must learn in the course, so that the student who succeeds can do so by focusing on the substance of learning. Were professors in law school not called professor? Yes, they were referred to as professor. Is it far-fetched to consider that if something looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then likely it could be a duck? No, it's not far-fetched. No encounter with any law professor left me unimproved by his or her demonstration of traits or skills worthy of emulation. Still, in light of the ordinary meaning most people give to words such as textbook and professor by reference to college education, my hidden ball can be summed up as a puzzle of finding myself presented with a casebook and law professors that walked like ducks, talked like ducks, but were not ducks. Fortunately, once tutoring revealed the ball that was hidden to me in terms of my first-generation law student background, it enabled me to then invest my limited time and money more productively in resources that made a difference. It enabled me to direct that investment towards working with less avoidable wheel spinning on the requirements I had come to law school to be shaped by into a knight whose sword is the law, as I worked on meeting them. Early days in Dante's Inferno. See if you can imagine the following in light of your knowledge of the foregoing. It's day 1 of your torts class at sunny, beautiful SEU Law. You can feel your innermost self taking inventory of the people in the seats, 3 rows of 12 seats that can swing out on a pivot, 2 per table arranged in concentric half arcs around the light brown lectern, equipped with a mic, from which the speaker remains absent. There's Sam from orientation day, white-skinned, a head of curly brown hair, hazel-colored eyes, neither overweight nor underweight, wearing dress pants and a dress shirt, mentioned that his mother had a law firm who answered smoothly during the orientation day icebreaker that he did his undergrad at Stanford. There's Rebecca, white-skinned, blonde hair, trimmed neatly at the level of her shoulder blades, blue eyes, speaks American English with twice the usual nasal twang, who said her father was a tax lawyer and who added, on that day, that she had gotten her MD from UC Davis. There's Paul, white-skinned, tall and lanky, brown eyes, his head of straight brown-colored hair shaved on the sides and tending to spike on the top, said his parents owned and operated an immigration law firm, who on that day of orientation had said to the law professor heading the orientation, after the latter had slipped into his spiel casually, that he had done his undergrad at UC Berkeley, that I too did my undergrad as a Berkeley bear, to which the professor had fist-pumped the air. You, as I did, have arrived a half hour early and have taken a seat in the front row at the far right end of that arc, looking towards the lectern, nearest to the door on that side of the classroom because of the moderate claustrophobia you felt as you walked into the classroom. You have placed your blue tort law and alternatives textbook strategically so as to make it appear that the seat to the left beside you at the same table is occupied because of that feeling of claustrophobia. With 5 minutes remaining before the scheduled start time, an Anglo-American lady named Amber, white-skinned, blonde hair, hazel-colored eyes, average height, squarish build, appears and hovers by that seat until you look up, and then she slowly says with the look the rectitudinous might direct at someone chewing gum, I believe this seat's not taken, so I shall sit here. Thank you very much. A pang of alarm hit you as you heard her announce her claim together with strategic use of hyperbolic formality, as if you had been caught with your hands in the cookie jar by the headmistress herself, and you now drag your textbook over to the invisible boundary at your half of the table and say with forced friendliness, nope, it's all yours. Amber smirked and let out a faint chuckle as she sat down, saying, that's what I thought. I walked in and saw a book there, and then I said to myself, wait, there's no extra backpack or anything else around, so I'm pretty sure it's not taken. Feeling yet too green to know that each word I uttered could and would be used against me, I said with a conciliatory smile, fair enough. I'm just a bit claustrophobic, so I was trying to get a bit of extra space. She retorted and let out another faint chuckle. Well, since it's fair to you and to me, I'll sit here. And besides, it seems to me that you've got plenty of space. Plus, I don't see anyone else taking extra seats. People People sitting next to an empty space aren't placing their books there, so you'll be fine. Feeling that defeat was all but certain, but not entirely unimpressed by Amber's assertiveness in her claims, I did not have a chance to reply nonetheless, because before I could reply, a sudden hush fell over the room's simmering voices. A stocky Anglo-American man, about whom it struck me that a class clown could have quipped, could pass for a descendant of the venerable George Washington. Wavy white hair, white skin, broad, high, and smooth forehead, round spectacle-like glasses, tight lips, had entered through the door to my right, with hurried pause, shoulders back, chest bulging forward defiantly, his chin and head raised at no one in particular, and a slight smile on his lips. He was observed by his expectant audience as, without looking at the class, he placed 2 books on the lectern, a paperback titled Understanding Torts, and the same textbook I had, except it was the teacher's edition. Before he paused, glanced down at his shoes once, placed his hands in the lateral pockets of his pants, and rose his chin and head defiantly before his audience. Without further delay, with a nasal twang and a question that sounded like a command, he referred to the only information that would be affirmatively facilitated, short of exam scheduling information, during the entire 14-week semester, i.e. the class syllabus, containing in substance the name of the casebook, a list of topics and cases mapped to or from the table of contents of the casebook, and the list of the 4 or 5 students who were on the on-call panel for each week of the 14 weeks of class. Will the students on this week's on-call panel raise their hands? You can volunteer to give us the facts to the first assigned case, which is Hamilton v. Jenner, or I'll select one of you to do so. Before that, since this is our first class, and you might have questions about me, let me briefly tell you about my background. I did my undergraduate at Stanford University, where I majored in philosophy. After that, I attended and graduated from Stanford Law School. After that, I went into private practice, but decided to go into teaching after several years because, well, it's much less boring. Well, that's enough about me. If you have any questions, you can bring them to my attention during my office hours, which are already posted, although I cannot make it to today's office hours because I have a meeting with a client that was made a month in advance and cannot be rescheduled, as that would conflict with an upcoming visit that I'll be making to England to give a talk there. Sam, who had volunteered to give the facts of the case and take questions in the role of counsel for the plaintiffs, struck me in my churning stomach as having access to some secret summary of that case, which in turn turned me to wondering if his mother had ever taken him to observe her work in her law firm, or explained how to use a casebook, or how to present a case from a casebook in law school. So this case involves an appeal by my clients, the plaintiffs, Maxine Hamilton and her spouse, from the trial court's adverse ruling on their claim, which was based on a theory of strict liability. My clients were injured in a car accident caused by the defendant Jenner, who had a history of seizures that had been under control pursuant to medical supervision when he lost control of his car during an unexpected seizure. I looked at my 2-page brief of the case and was bewildered and relieved that I had not been assigned to the on-call panel during the first week of class. That's it? That's all you had to say? I felt like I had just dodged a bullet as I thought of my own brief's sprawling 2-page length under headings of facts, issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion. Each member of the on-call panel performed his or her role with similar sufficiency to Sam's as the discussion progressed beyond Hamilton to the remaining assigned cases. As if finding myself adrift at sea in the fog without a compass, I wondered if I had unconsciously taken a bathroom break at the wrong moment, at a critical moment in which the secret to using one's casebook and discussing cases had been disclosed to everyone else, so that only I ended up with a lacuna as to that pivotal piece of knowledge. In that state, I recalled that during orientation day I had seen a law professor direct himself to half of the room that struck me as a blob of 20+ white Anglo-American forms, like a white cell spread out in front of him that had engulfed 3 or 4 non-white faces at random positions. Can anyone tell me how you're going to brief cases to present them in class? I was startled as I heard almost everyone's joining to respond as if it were knowledge so common that its utterance were tedious. IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion. Whereupon, with the sense of trying to both keep up the appearance that I was following along and actually follow along, I had heard the law professor adding, "Okay, so you know about IRAC. Yeah, don't take it too literally, but it's not a bad approximation of what you have to do. So how about the facts? What facts are you going to discuss?" A youthful-looking Anglo-American lady who looked like she was still in her 20s had raised her hand, had been called, and had said unequivocally, "You're supposed to present the facts that were necessary to the court's holding." The law professor answered, "Yeah, that's about right. You know, if the issue is whether the defendant breached the contract for the sale of widgets, are you going to talk about the color of the defendant's t-shirt? No. Well, I'm not a contracts professor, but I remember enough contract law to advise you to focus on the facts that go to a determination of the main issue in the case according to the holding, such as whether there was a contract, a breach of contract, or whether a defense to the alleged breach existed. And if no defense existed, then to what damages the plaintiff may be entitled, except for a guideline of organization in terms terms of issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion, I took away little else from that orientation day presentation than the sense of, it's all Greek to me, and everyone else speaks Greek but me. Now in torts, I experienced relief that had been omitted from the first on-call panel, as Sam's summation had struck me as even enjoyable,
whereas I was horrified that my facts were literally a rewriting of the facts as they were presented in the textbook, i.e.
plaintiffs Maxine Hammondtree and her husband sued defendant for personal injuries and property damage arising out of an automobile accident. Cause was tried to a jury. Evidence showed that on afternoon of April 25th, 1967, defendant was driving his 1959 Chevrolet home from work. At the same time, plaintiff Maxine Hammondtree was working in a bicycle shop she owned and operated with her husband. Without warning, defendant's car crashed through the wall of the shop. Automobile struck Maxine and caused personal injuries and damage to the shop. Defendant claimed he became unconscious during an epileptic seizure, losing control of his car. Defendant did not recall the accident. I likewise came out of a contracts class on yet another day with crumpled pages and pages of my extensive, sterile case briefs, with a sense of dark days and of circling around the same torment across my first year classes until I hired a tutor. Tutoring game changer. A sense of wishing to redo that first day in torts came later, after I had hired Ricardo Ramos, Esquire, the Mexican-American HLS grad, lawyer, and tutor who had been recommended to me by my law school admissions essay advisor. Ricardo nodded during the first of our weekly periodic meetings as I shared my reflections and frustrations, harking back all the way to my experience on that first day of torts, as if to express the depth of that frustration. Reassuringly, he had said, "I feel you, Ivan. I was there too, just like you, feeling the exact thing during my entire first year of law school." I read later that Justice Sonia Sotomayor described her law school experiences in terms of feeling like a visitor landing in an alien country, and I realized I was in good company. Put bluntly, the non-affluent aren't the ones filling up law schools. And who does that leave? Mexican Americans? African Americans? People who go to ordinary public school? No. Law schools are businesses, and like businesses, they cater to their clients, who may already have a particular frame of reference. I'm sure you can think of a few differences in terms of your starting frame of reference, even between the experience of buying an elite car like a Lamborghini and that of buying your standard Ford four-door sedan. Place the buyer of the Ford in the Lamborghini buyer's place, and what do you imagine the Ford buyer could feel in that different informational environment? Like a fish out of water. As a Mexican American with a similar background to yours, in terms of language and resources, I did not start off knowing what my law school peers did, nor many of the operative assumptions that prevailed at my law school. And like you and Justice Sotomayor, I could feel that difference. With a sense that it would be worthwhile to identify and correct my mistakes from that early period, I agreed to Ricardo's proposal. I think we could use Hammondtree v. Jenner to make the law school experience a bit less confusing, because it seems to me that an obstacle here is that it could seem that your casebook functions similarly to a college textbook, and that your professors function similarly to college professors, neither of which is accurate. Clearing that up does not mean that law school is going to be easy, but at least it could be less confusing and more efficient use of your time and resources. So let's both turn to that case now and try to find a place for it in the grand scheme of things. You'll find that your job is to become an expert on each topic assigned to you in your syllabus, as if to develop the ability with it to assert clients' rights or avoid liability. And to do that, you'll find it helpful to not begin with your casebook, but instead to go to a secondary source, such as the Rudder Group's guides, as if you were doing research on a problem, i.e., how to persuasively assert rights or avoid liability. So these secondary sources are closer to being your textbook than the typical casebook. This might not be a hidden ball to everyone, but to those who aren't in the know, it's like enrolling in a conservatory of music and finding yourself required to buy books filled with musical scores, take them to class, discuss them in class, and all of that without being told by people who present themselves as music professors that you cannot learn composition effectively with that book alone. Because you're new to the field, you have to get enough comprehensive understanding of the causes of action in a field like torts, such as that generally you can assert rights for intentional torts, torts arising from negligence, or torts arising from strict liability. And then you'll want to get familiar with your specific topics, such as negligence per se. Of course, to learn the law and how to assert rights or avoid liability with that law persuasively, a lawyer would see how the rule was applied in a particular case, such as in one of the cases that appear in your casebook. Although a lawyer would instead find it in Westlaw or LexisNexis, she would then apply that rule accordingly to her own legal problem by creating a defensible persuasive argument for her client. Thus, your casebook is not the end of your task. It's only a tool. It's unlike a college textbook that you read in college, as if retaining its content were the end. However, your lack of real legal problems to work on means you have to find them, work them out with the rules you're learning, and check your work against solutions written by a qualified source, i.e., defensible arguments according to a professional. With that in mind, if you were to reread Hammondtree now, before that first torts class, I'd venture to say that you'd agree that you would have been better served by knowing the following, which you could find in a legal treatise. 1. The law of torts has concerned itself with the issue of who should have to pay when injury occurs, such as when a victim is injured by a driver who has done everything doctors have told him to do to avoid seizures and whose seizures have appeared to be under control so that he had no inkling or warning that he was about to have a seizure. 2. The law of torts generally can be a means of obtaining compensation on the part of a plaintiff for injury based on the following degrees of fault that can be attributed to the defendant. A. Strict liability, i.e. liability regardless of how careful or faultless the defendant was. B. Negligence, which usually supports a finding of liability when the evidence persuades the person responsible for deciding the facts by 50.01% or more that the defendant created risk of injury to others, but failed to conduct him or herself as a reasonably prudent person would have under like circumstances. Or C. Intentional conduct. 3. In unintentional automobile accident cases, such as Hamilton v. Jenner, however, the law of torts in California has determined that strict liability cannot be a basis for the plaintiff's compensation, but instead liability in those cases depends on negligence. Before I answered affirmatively, I felt myself hurled back in time to that early period of my law school journey in which I first read Hamilton v. Jenner in light of the ideas that Ricardo had just expressed. I saw that in addition to the basic fact of the occurrence of an accident, the key facts were that the defendant could not be described as negligent, and that the plaintiffs had sought to recover compensation from the defendant for their losses, not based on a theory of negligence. They had brought a claim on this basis, but they had withdrawn it, but rather based solely on absolute liability, i.e. strict liability. From that position, I felt frustrated that without Ricardo's heads up, I failed to make those relations between facts and the main issue of strict liability in a non-intentional automobile accident case. I am frustrated at having missed the opportunity to fully connect with my law professors' ensuing discussion with other students on the rationale behind imposing strict liability on products manufacturers, but not on subjecting insurers to liability on the facts of Hamilton. I thought angrily of the investment of time and money I had already employed in even applying to law school, as I saw myself again in that early period of law school, spending an hour in the school library reading that case alone, opting to include as much information as possible for fear that I could miss something important unwittingly. I found that the most relevant comment on this wheel spinning had been, if you find yourself taking 1 hour to read a case, that's okay at this stage. The language and manner of writing is new to you, and the material is extraordinarily dense, but the material was not unmanageably dense. The language was susceptible to clarification with a dictionary, and the manner of writing struck me as refreshingly structured and precise. It struck me that these comments could have been productively directed at a different audience from me. I thought with annoyance of how I had then gotten distracted by follow-up notes and questions, and the extensive citation in these to Oliver Wendell Holmes' criticism of the strict liability system, with follow-up questions such as, is Holmes persuasive? That lacked even an attempt by the author to provide an answer. However, my annoyance softened when I recalled the voice of my admissions essay tutor, pointing out that some aspects of exclusion in the US might be attributable to a lack of awareness among people who had the power to make things different. Perhaps, too, my hidden ball was attributable to a similar lack of awareness. Pain, however, did not go away, and pained by the wasting of time and money I saw in that early period, I looked at my case brief from that period, which Ricardo requested that I email him for feedback, and described to Ricardo that my issue section began with whether plaintiff may recover for injury caused by an automobile accident, where, and then after the where, I had given a verbatim recitation of the facts. With that sense of pain, I also explained that my rule section included a verbatim reproduction of the court's rule section, lest I miss something I thought was unimportant but turned out to be important, i.e., under the present state of the law found in appellate authorities beginning with Waters v. Pacific Coast Dairy Inc., driver rendered unconscious from sharp pain in left arm and shoulder, through Ford v. Carew and English, fainting spells from strained heart muscles, Zabunoff v. Walker, sudden sneeze, and Tannehill v. Pacific Motor Trans Company, heart attack. The foregoing cases generally hold that liability of a driver, suddenly stricken by an illness rendering him unconscious, for injury resulting from an accident and occurring during that time, rests on principles of negligence. A manufacturer or retailer is strictly liable in tort when an article he places on the market, knowing that it is to be used without inspection for defects, proves to have a defect that causes injury to a human being. Greenman v. Yuba Power Products Inc., Vandermark v. Ford Motor Company. And we decline to superimpose the absolute liability of products liability cases upon drivers under the circumstances here. The theory on which those cases are predicated is that manufacturers, retailers, and distributors of products are engaged in the business of distributing goods to the public and are an integral part of the overall producing and marketing enterprise that should bear the cost of injuries from defective parts. Vandermark v. Ford Motor Company, Greenman v. Yuba Power Products Inc. This policy hardly applies here, and it is not enough to simply say, as do appellants, that the insurance carriers should be the ones to bear the cost of injuries to innocent victims on a strict liability basis. Those feelings were not limited to torts, as I told Ricardo that, without a heads up like that one, it feels as if in contract, civil procedure, criminal law, and so on, I'm expected to guess where the hidden ball is being kept by a sneering figure as I spin my wheels, on top of paying for that pleasure. I felt reassured as Ricardo nodded and said, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that law school can't seem that way. It sure seemed that way to me. I myself could have benefited from someone fleshing out a little more the bare assertion that my professors would toss cryptically out there. Your casebooks are not college textbooks. When I heard that, I asked myself, so what are they? But you've already gotten an intro to research, so let's move forward and answer the question, how to use a casebook. In other words, supposing that Hammond-Tree v. Jenner and other cases in your casebook had an idea that a lawyer could need, which we now know in the case of Hammond-Tree v. Jenner is the idea that a driver who is suddenly stricken by illness, such as a seizure, and causes injury is not subject to liability on the basis of strict liability, but rather on principles of negligence. How would that lawyer get to that case? Would that lawyer start with your casebook? No. A lawyer dealing with a legal problem like that of defending Jenner would start her research elsewhere into the question of whether her client can be subject to strict liability, such as in a secondary source on torts, say California torts. She could find the section titled Liability for Drivers for Motor Vehicle Accidents, in which she could then find a subpart on general negligence principles applicable to motor vehicle accident cases, in which in turn she could find a subsection titled Effective Age, Lack of License, or Disability on Duties of Driver. In this subsection, she could then find the rule statement that a driver who is suddenly stricken by illness such as a seizure and causes injury is not subject to liability on the basis of strict liability, but rather is subject to liability on principles of negligence. Further, she would learn in the footnotes that the case that serves as authority for this proposition in California is Hammond-Tree v. Jenner. She would learn how to use this rule by reading the case with the rule in mind before applying it to her own set of facts. For someone new to the law, under the time pressures of law school, however, reading all the volumes of California torts is simply not practical, but you can find summaries of it with the basic comprehensive view of the law that you need, such as understanding torts, with citations to authoritative cases that could include the cases in your casebook or a different case that illustrates the same principle as a case in your casebook. Still, you'll want to learn how the rules work, primarily to pass the bar exam, which one hopes the professors of those courses that are tested on by the bar exam will have in mind as a goal in designing their syllabi. Since you don't have your own cases to apply those rules to for purposes of learning these rules, in the courses that cover the material that the bar exam will test you on, you'll want to write essays using released bar exam questions and answers. Although you should not expect the released answers written by examinees to be 100% correct, you can instead find more reliable answers to those problems written by qualified persons on baressays.com. After that, I experienced something better than Ricardo Ramos's prediction. Law school will not be easy, but at least it will be less confusing. I invested my time and money accordingly in the resources that Ricardo had mentioned. Further, with my hidden ball out in the open, with a better informed definition of my task, and with a better informed description of the resources around me, my days of continuous work became days of continuous productive work. This was the work I had come to law school for, to become a dynamic initiator capable of applying detail-oriented, creative intellectual energy, the empowering language of American law, and persuasion in writing and in speech in the service of asserting people's rights. As I advanced towards practical courses and clinics, including appellate advocacy, negotiation, immigration law clinic, and interviewing and counseling, I was buoyed by my successes in them because my primary challenge was no longer that of clarifying the nature of my learning tools, but that of pushing to the max my industriousness, problem solving, people skills, and creativity. The end.